Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Wandering Road Podcast. I'm your host Chris, alongside my co-host Dean, and today's episode is our 50th episode, which we're super excited to bring to you guys. I'm super excited that, we were able to make it this far, episode 50. And for today's episode, we have a very special guest with us today to talk about Irish paranormal stories, myth, and folklore. Joining us all the way from across the pond is the host of the Great Stories Pod, Mr. Trev Downey. How you doing tonight, Trev?
I'm good, Chris. It's great to join you and Dean. Very, very much looking forward to this. Had you guys in my ears for the last couple of days, which is, both disconcerting and wonderful, as you can imagine, with the topics you cover. I'm really looking forward to this. I want to state from the start, I'm no expert on any of the topics you said. I'm very much an enthusiast. So we'll see where it takes us.
I think this might be one of the most exciting ones we've ever done because, first of all, I don't remember the last time I've talked to somebody who's actually from Ireland. Chris is going to have to reel me in because I'm going to go off on tangents and ask stuff that is completely off topic probably, so bear with me on that. But I have to tell a quick story. When Chris was talking about bringing Trev on, first he was telling me about it. It's like he has an Irish friend, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like we could talk about really cool mythology and stuff, and I was looking forward to that. But then I heard Trev from Chris's side on an audio call, or an audio recording, and it was the smoothest, sexiest Irish voice. And I'm like, wait a minute, is your friend Colin Farrell? Now, I don't know if you like Colin Farrell, not Trev. You might think he's an asshole, but I really did think that when I heard him. I'm like, that guy, he sounds a lot like Colin Farrell. And then when he came on the camera, I'm like, oh, it is Colin Farrell's older brother. So just, you can't see him, but he's a good-looking Irish dude who has a good voice, so go listen to his show.
Dean, that's too much, my friend, but I'll take it. I will take it. I'm a big fan of Colin Farrell, actually. I don't know if Chris might know, one of the things we have in common is a certain other channel, and we did recently a show about that guy's career. So no, big fan of Colin. Yeah, fair play. It's a very much a compliment I'm happy to take.
First, you got to tell us where you're located. Your patented intro.
My patented intro, yes. I am, and as I was saying to Dean earlier on, this is going to become very relevant. I am in beautiful rural Ireland. Specifically, I live in County Meath, which was originally the 5th province of 5 in Ireland. It was the home of the High Kings, and literally just up the road from me is that place, right? Tara, you may have heard of Tara before, on which stands the Leah Fall, which we may come back to, which is the stone of destiny, the stone which basically would shout out when in the environs of the new king, which is pretty cool mythology. Of course, I'm just over the road from the Boyne, which, of course, the Battle of the Boyne, you may know that. We may get into that later on. I know that's more history, but I've been interested in some really esoteric, occult takes on the Battle of the Boyne recently that we might get round to. Kind of slap bang in the middle of everything. Also just over the road from Newgrange, which again, I think is a touchstone most people in the States will have heard of. One of the oldest monuments in the world. So they will come around in the course of the podcast, no doubt.
Dude, I can see this podcast going. You're gonna have to put a hard stop on us, Trev, because we're probably gonna take this way too long, and we're probably gonna have to have you come back on at some point.
I'd love to. I'm here all night, whatever you need, and yeah, let's if it's good, we'll go again for sure.
Oh, absolutely, and we can't forget that you're also a Liverpool fan. We're both Liverpool fans. Greatest club in the world, and we're top of the league right now. So suck it, Arsenal. Suck it, Man City. But Trev, as you were talking to us earlier, you said you wanted to share some personal experiences.
Right. So this is where you guys tell me to shut up if it's not interesting. Okay. Because I've listened, like I said, to a cross section of your shows, so I have some notion of what it is that you guys are doing and the topics you're trying to cover. And I love all of them, actually, if I'm being completely honest. I was saying, Dean, to Chris earlier on that I really feel sorry for my Twitter feed because some of them will be getting that sort of diatribe that Chris just gave us, and they will be geopolitical nerds going, "What is he talking about?" And then I'll say something about the occult, and all the Liverpool heads will be saying, "What is he talking about?" So I have this sort of eclectic mix of people, but you guys, as far as I can see, your wheelhouse is very much my main wheelhouse, which is everything a bit off beam, everything a bit weird, everything a bit difficult to explain. And so in my own life, I've had a couple of those things. And I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a flavor of it, because I think an awful lot of people think that just because you're from a certain place, you have these specific tendencies, qualities, whatever. And that is not the case. Let me assure you that almost no Irish people I know are sort of naturally sort of mystical or any of that nonsense. We don't stand there with Aran jumpers looking out over the sea wistfully. That doesn't tend to be the case, but for some reason, this type of nonsense has followed me around since I was a little kid. The first thing I remember was my granny telling me that the Banshee, who's, you know, one of the most famous Irish mythological creatures, she is this, basically, it depends. It's usually a hag. It's usually a sort of very scary looking older lady. It can occasionally be a beautiful woman. What they all tend to have in common is that they're brushing their hair when they're seen. And as they're seen, or just before they're seen, there's this horrific screeching sound that they produce. And the Banshee was a sort of sign of an impending death. And when I was a very young kid, I think maybe 6 or 7, my granny told me, she had no business telling me this story, that she had been scared out of her wits when she was my age because the Banshee, she'd heard the Banshee on the walk home from the bog. And by the way, a lot of my stories are going to be about the country because we are rural as fuck here. That's just all there is to it. I think we didn't have a town or city dweller in my family until a generation ago. So that's basically where I'm at. And as she returned from the bog, she thought she saw heard a rustle in a tree, and she just got this eerie feeling. And this is one of the things that I'm going to be able to relate to as I go through my life. This feeling, I had it last night walking down the hall, that there was something behind me. It's unpleasant, and I think it's not something everybody endures, but I seem to be sort of blessed stroke cursed with it. And she hears this horrible, horrible, screeching, piercing wail. And, you know, I don't need to tell you how the story ends. The next day, her dad passes away. And it's, you know, it marked my cards very early on. Within a couple of years of that, um, this is a story that I shared on the Great Stories podcast, which is available on all podcast hosts, that I kind of really, if I'm honest, I reined it in a bit. I was talking to my pal Neil, and I was explaining to him how, you know, we were doing a story called The Man in the Black Suit by Stephen King. And I was telling him when I was a kid, I had an experience of meeting a guy in a suit at the bottom of my garden, and it was very weird. And it freaked everybody out who heard it, but they didn't really hear the true version because, like I said, I think I'm 7, 8 at this stage, maybe 8, 9. And we have a sort of a ditch and a bank going around our property. And I was at the bottom of that and just about to climb over the bank and into the ditch, which is just grass. And we used to use it to hang out and make forts and stuff. And there in the middle of nowhere where we live is this wild-eyed man in his, appeared to me, sort of mid-40s, haggard, bedraggled looking guy in a blue suit, dark blue suit, pretty pristine looking dress on him, but himself was very haggard. But his eyes, lads, his eyes have never left me. I was so disturbed. I ran with a fear that I don't know how I ran. You know, that kind of fear where you're almost rigid, but I managed to force it. I got back up to the house. Of course, I told my folks, and I remember listening to a couple of your shows today, and one of the common threads was that people tell these stories and then they're not believed, especially children telling these stories. And I was very much not believed. It was well, who would be around here? And that's a very good point they made. And why would anyone be around here? And that's, again, a very good point that they made. But here he was. This was not imagination. And I've kind of lived with it since. And it went quiet then until I was sort of 19, 20. And that's when I had my next one. Now I'm going to shut up for a minute because I feel like I'm hogging your airtime and I want you guys to jump in.
No, sir. Please continue.
Really? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. It's your show, brother.
How do you feel about precog?
Enlighten me.
So precognition, as in seeing the future, as in predicting dreams, perhaps. Okay. What do you reckon? What have you come across this as a topic? I haven't seen it in any of your show synopses.
Oh, I don't think we've ever covered that, Dean. That's actually a good topic to cover because I could tell a...
sorry, you got a story? I was just going to say, you got a story? I got a story. And Trev's got a story. So let's, Trev, jump into your story and then we'll get into it.
Yeah.
So obviously, as explained, I'm where I am. And the university that I attended was Trinity College in Dublin. So I had to commute for the first little while, and then I eventually got an apartment. So I was sharing this apartment in a place called Rathmines in Dublin. And I had a dream. I think it was a Thursday or Friday night, about the apartment. It was a basement flat, a basement kind of apartment's very fancy word for it. It was a flat. It was rough enough kind of a place, and we were in the basement. We had no real view to speak of. Our windows looked out onto a wall. It was incredibly dark, and so I had a dream that night that I had a really disturbing experience where I arrived back at the house and. On a Sunday night, having been home for the weekend and replenished my stocks and met my friends and gone out in the local place at home. And I got back up on a Sunday night and I, in the dream, opened the door and there was a single rose petal on each step of the 2 flights of stairs down to my apartment. And then in the dream, when I get to the door, I'm really scared because the door is ajar. And I go, shit. And in the dream, I pushed the door open and I'm looking around and I see carnage, all my stuff, my CDs on the floor, stuff just everywhere. And then some blur, it was a sort of a dark shape, it barges into me and heads on up the stairs, and I'm left in complete fear. And I woke up in a fright. It was the first nightmare I think I'd had in possibly 10 years. I wasn't really plagued by nightmares. I was very lucky as a kid. Anyway, fast forward 2 weeks and I'm coming home for real from my home on a Sunday night. And I get to the outside door and I turn the key and I get in. And just inside the door of the apartment building, there was a little console table. And on that console table, there used to be a thing. I don't know what you guys call it. In Ireland, we call it potpourri, which is a French phrase. It was like little pieces of scented paper. Do you know what I mean? So
we call that too.
You guys, all right. So there was one of those always sitting there, and it was probably there for 15 years. It had long since lost its scent or whatever. Lads, it was red pieces of paper, and on each step of the 2 flights of fucking stairs, there was a red piece of paper, almost centrally placed on each step. And I was thinking, I told nobody about this dream, nobody. So I said, somebody is taking the piss out of me here. This is ridiculous. So I'm going down kind of very wary, thinking, wow, what a coincidence. I can't wait to tell the lads in the pub later on. I got down to the door and it was ajar, and I'm going, oh shit. I make my way. Now I've got that creeping fear. I've got that, spine tingle, neck stiffness, and I'm pushing the door open. I've got CDs on the floor, lads. My t-shirt's thrown on the ground. I'm looking around. It's pure carnage. Stuff from the kitchen. And I'm just about getting over my fear and the experience of it when some guy barges into me in dark clothing, knocks me clean over. I fall into the sofa and charges up the stairs and out the door. And I stayed there in that corner against the sofa for about 15 minutes going, what the fuck is happening here? It was beyond the beyonds. I had another couple of those, but nothing quite as graphic as that. One was a premonition of being mugged on Grafton Street, which happened, and a few other things. But that one was by far the most graphic. And there's no explanation for that, guys, except some sort of different version of reality than we are being fed.
Before we share, Chris and I share our stories, I want to ask you, Trev. So, what is your perspective on what is happening there? Because I know there's probably two general forms of thought when something like that is happening. Either one, it's the human brain that is capable of formulating and calculating or doing anything like kind of crazy calculations because of all the computing power in our brain. Somehow, some way that comes to us. Or the other side is purely external. Maybe it is like a warning from an external source, like a spirit or a loved one or something. So we've already established that what you experienced is real, and it's extremely unlikely that you would have happened to have a dream that directly fit your experience in reality, especially so close to the dream and the event itself. So like we already know that something weird is going on here. But what do you, Trev, think actually happened from the outside or inside perspective whenever you had that dream?
One of the major areas of interest for me in my life that I read a lot about and learn as much as I can about is consciousness. And I've sort of made a study of as much of that as I can recently. And to get to an answer comparatively quick, Dean, I'm very there are not many things that I dismiss out of hand, but one of the few things that I do dismiss out of hand, for the most part, is the scientism, scientific materialism, the absolute nuts and bolts nature of reality, and that's all there is to it, because there's clearly more to life than that. And so therefore I find myself probably disinclined to think it's that first option, and more inclined to think it's something else, some other phenomenon. What it is, I'm not going to even hazard a guess, but I think it's very much in that realm of what you're speaking about. Some other thing is occurring there, whether it is a warning, whether it is perhaps, and here's another alternative, a previously lived experience or a parallel experience that you somehow gain access to. They, to me, are far more fascinating and I think likely explanations than somehow our brain is attributed all this almost godlike power to be able to be this supercomputer and all the rest of it. And I don't want to derail you guys too early, but one of the things I was looking at today was just exactly that. There's a fantastic podcast, I don't know if you've ever heard it, called Skeptico, and the host Alex Akiris is currently doing a series of dialogues with one of those large learning model AI creations. This one's called Claude, I think it's is the one, and then also Bart, the Google one. And basically, the whole thing is about putting that thing on the spot and asking it about consciousness and the accepted views of what consciousness are. And it turns out, guys, that the AI model has been programmed to give stock answers, to be obstructive, to be disingenuous. And when put on the spot, has to say, oh, you raise a good point. And, it feels almost as though there's a thing there that's being deliberately occulted and hidden. And therefore, I'm very suspicious of anything that's just pure scientific materialism. So that's a long-winded answer, man. But I think it's important because it might come back later on, some of the stuff we're talking about. You're talking here about a boy who's brought up very strongly Catholic. And so you have all sorts of a mishmash here going on in my brain.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the whole Catholic thing because I was raised Catholic, Dean was raised Catholic, so we all have that in common. But to jump back into the whole premonition stuff and the, predicting the future, I actually have a relative that when they dream, they kind of, I don't want to say like they're like fucking Nostradamus, but when they kind of have like these predictive dreams, it kind of follows in that same pattern. It's not necessarily the same like path that it takes, but bits and pieces here and there through the process of getting to the actual end result that they dreamt about has happened before. And personally for me, I've had situations, where you're walking down the street or something and you get, what is it called, deja vu or whatever it is. And it's like, I've been here before. I feel like I've experienced this before, and it's really weird. So I've had a couple of dreams like that where I would dream about, I'd be downtown and I'd be walking across the street and I'd dream like a group of people. And if I walk by them, like I get attacked or mugged or something like that. And like, it wouldn't be like weeks later, but it would be like maybe like 6 months to a year later, I'd be in that same exact situation. And then in my mind, it just clicks. And I'm like, oh shit, I dreamt about this before. Then I would cross the street or do the complete opposite of what I did in the dream to avoid that, that result happening that occurred in that dream. So I definitely think that there is something to that. And that's a topic we'll have to talk about, Dean. I mean, if we want to do a deep dive on that topic, you're more than welcome to join us on that one, Trev. But Dean, what was your experience you were going to share?
I probably should have gone first because mine's going to be way more boring than yours, both of your guys's. But it's actually, it might be a good segue because it kind of opens the aperture to share my side of experience with Irish folklore. So like I've said, I've never been to Ireland, but I did have a grandfather, and it's kind of strange. I say he's my grandfather. He was really like my dad's friend that I called grandfather. He wasn't really related to me, but he was a close friend of the family. And he had this cabin up in the woods in Western Pennsylvania. And I used to go up there a few times a year with my dad and do these big trips. But he would, the grandfather guy would live up there year round. So he had this house, 2-story house, wraparound porch, beautiful property, lots of trails around. The next neighbor was like a quarter mile down the road. It was very rural. He always established himself as Irish, even though I don't think he might have come from Ireland when he was younger, like a very young age, like an immigrant, but he never had an accent or anything. But he was very, very deeply connected to Irish culture. He had all kinds of Irish stuff around, knickknacks, and he would always talk about it and whatnot. And he would tell me stories about, I know, Trev, I'm going to catch shit for this because I know this isn't a thing that people in Ireland really talk about much, but he always talked about leprechauns, and he would like tell me like stories about them, like they're hiding in the trees and stuff. And I would always go out and look for them. Not to go off on a tangent too much, but he also, by the way, told me about the Banshee, stories about the Banshee, which I can't wait to get into later. But so my experience that sticks with me to this day with precognition, and one that I'm so sure was a case, because everybody, like Chris said, everybody has these moments where we have deja vu, where you might dream something that kind of is like similar to what we're experiencing. And I have gotten that like everybody else. But there's one moment in my life that happened up at that camp where I'm sure there was some strange thing going on. So we had just gone up there for like a trip for like a week or so. And my dad had these, we call them quads, but they're ATVs, all-terrain vehicles. And it's not the kind that you think like a go-kart kind. It's the kind that's like a single seater that's open. And it's almost like a motorcycle with 4 wheels, sort of. So I would get to ride a smaller one and my dad have a bigger one. And I would always look forward to riding the trails like that. So when we got up there, it was like the first or second night, we hadn't gone out yet, and it was dry. And then the night before we were going to go out the next day to go quadding for the first time up there, I had this dream where I was looking down and I was traveling very quickly, and I saw this red, mucky dirt passing beneath me, and I saw my foot. And I also like had this sense of like smell and sound, and it's just like very strange, this compilation of all sorts of experiences or phenomena experiences in my dream. The next day, or that night, I guess, it had rained. And then the next day it was muddy, and I'm out there driving on the trail, and I'm looking down and I'm watching the dirt pass beneath me, and I'm feeling and smelling, and it just like hits me like I dreamt this exact image in my head. Like it was like a movie, like looking down at that exact spot at that exact time, seeing the mud pass underneath me. I was so sure that I had dreamt that the night before. And then like at that moment, I'm like, that's some precognition stuff right there.
For sure.
Anyway, like I said, boring story, but my foray into precognition. But you know what I would like to do? Actually, I would like to, if you guys want to talk about anything else with that, that's fine. But I want to jump back to some questions I had about the experience with the Banshee that your family had. And the first thing I wanted to ask you was, when that experience happened, did everybody else believe her in the family? Did she tell anybody else for years, or did she kind of just tell you later in detail? What was the perception of your immediate family of that experience? Because it kind of sounded like she wasn't, like she was definitely open-minded to that sort of thing going on, but she hadn't experienced it until then. But I'm sure with the passing not too long after, everybody who would listen probably listened a little bit more to that story. So can you talk a little bit more about the believability and the people around you at that time who were listening to that story?
So she told me that she was so afraid she didn't want to say anything, because you can imagine a kid is not going to want to bring news like that home to a house. So she kind of lived with that for a long time on her own. She eventually did tell people, and there wasn't any pushback whatsoever. There was a lot more acceptance. So we're going back. I suppose my granny's coming up in the early part of the 20th century, and Ireland back then is properly. I mean, we were a third world nation until the 60s, really, if we're being perfectly honest. My father remembers the rural electrification of Ireland. So I mean, this is pre that. We're very, 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 very close to all the pagan and rich history of the country before Christianity ever raised its head around here whatsoever. And I often think, I don't know what you guys think, I often think that with the way that Catholicism was adopted in Ireland, that was like people just substituted one set of incredibly strong superstitions for another, if you want to look at it that way. And that's not to denigrate anyone's belief in religion. I'm just talking about the way in which we adopted it was enthusiastic, shall we say, in many ways. But always, guys, always there was this sub layer of older superstition and belief in things as silly as tugging your forelock at a magpie, and as serious as the Banshee. And the belief in that was, I would say, unquestioned until maybe 40, 50 years ago, when people, like I said, started to think with the cynicism of modernity that, science is all the answers. And I spoke to someone very recently who had a Banshee experience, and it ain't no scientific example that can explain away that. A very believable human who's not going to tell anyone else except me about it. So it's interesting. It's very interesting. I don't know if it kind of runs in families, guys, or what you think, but as far as how it was accepted in our family, it was unquestioned. And when she told me with an earnestness that I should understand this from a young age. So that's how serious, if you like, she was about it. And it was, when she did break it, very accepted.
Trev, I have a question for you. Have you ever heard one?
I haven't, man. And as with most of the stuff that I'm very interested in, whether it be the potential for beings of some sort or craft of some sort or whatever, anything like that interests me, I'm sadly lacking in those experiences. I just have the few little things I've told you about, a couple of others as we go through as well, that are linked, but never anything that directly links into any of the creatures of mythology, even, sadly, a leprechaun.
I would say that would be a blessing to not hear a Banshee or ever want to come across or hear one. I did want to ask you, revisiting that incident that you mentioned that you had as a kid, seeing that gentleman in that suit. Yeah. What do you think it was? Do you think it was some sort of like Irish folk creature, or do you think it might have been the devil himself making an appearance towards you? Because, they always say, like, I've heard stories of people saying like, oh, when they see like, oh, that was the devil, and it's always some gentleman in a suit, all dapper and all that type of stuff. So, I'm just kind of curious to get your perspective on what you think that was, or it might have just been some old drunk guy in a suit that got lost.
Yeah, you see, that the likelihood of that is so small that even my parents didn't even consider that to be something that they could use to reassure me. Um, we're properly out in the sticks here, and nobody dressed like that anyway. He was dressed like a guy from the early part of the century, and in a word, what I thought it was, Chris, was evil, just pure evil. I have will never forget that. I've had times in my life when I've been scared to death. I was chased by a gang when I was 14 or 15 of drug dealers. We were on holidays, and they took it exception to me and my brother, and I thought we were going to die, and that fear didn't compare. At one stage, one of my mother's inverted commas friends called to the house again when we were very young. I think I might have been 9 or 10. Rapped on the door. I answered the door idiotically, and he barges in and grabs me by the shoulders and says, "I'm going to break all your arms and legs." And even that fear did not compare to the fear that I felt. I don't know what that was, but it was wrong. You know what I mean by that? It was wrong, Chris.
And I've actually, you did mention like you've had throughout your life, you've been plagued with this feeling of someone behind you. Like I've definitely had that feeling. I just had that feeling today when I was out for a run. It was broad daylight. I just had the sense that I needed to turn around and check behind me because I was worried that somebody was going to like roll up on me or a bike was coming like careening at me. Nothing behind me whatsoever. But I totally feel you. It's not a fun feeling to have this sense that there's something towering over you or about to slam into you or do something behind you. Totally, completely believe that there are, in a lot of cases, there's something more going on there, especially when you turn around and there is something there. I've had those moments where, you have the sense that something's behind you and you turn around and there's something not evil or spiritual, but it's like someone is standing behind you and there's no other sense that you should have been able to pick up on other than the fact that you got that, the hair standing on the back of your head or the back of your neck. But in terms of that guy in the suit, the last thing I wanted to ask about that was, did this guy, okay, so you explained a little bit about where you were in your yard and where he was in relation to you, but he was facing you directly, staring at you. You felt this extremely heavy unease. So there was something weird going on there. Did he say anything to you? And what was the rest of that engagement like? Did he just stare? Did he blink? Is there anything else you can describe? And then finally, how did that engagement end? Did you run away and he stood there watching you, or did he turn around and leave? Is there anything other points about that you want to bring up?
Yeah, it's seared into my memory completely. So as I explained, I didn't actually. Our property is surrounded on three sides by just open expanse and fields, and so we have this sort of a hollow going around, sort of a ditch. It was grass lined, so it was ideal for playing. And when we were kids, it was fantastic. And there was a bank, and then the dip. So we had this almost like natural grassy trench running around. And I guess it would be a nice cozy place to hang out on a summer evening when the grass is dry. We used to do that, and our friends would come down and we'd play games or whatever. So I'm approaching the end of our property. It's about 3/4 of an acre down from the house, and I'm climbing up the bank, about to descend into that little ditch that I told you about, because I'd left like one of my toy guns or something there that I wanted to collect. And that's when, as I come up over the brow of the bank, I can see this guy. Now, the suit is the one thing, but it's the eyes that I'll never forget. There was no communication, verbal communication of any sort, but there was this wild-eyed, horrible, horrible sort of darkness to him. And he looked at me. Can I give you a word that I hope is expressive enough? Ravenously. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Was like there was some sort of consuming that evil bastard wanted to do. I don't know what it was, but I'm more and more convinced, as I was at the time, that it is an it as opposed to a he. I've never had a feeling of just unease to compare to that, and it was just the expression on the face. It was this evil, ravenous expression, and I mean, people might think that it's a nothing story, but I can tell you, I'm 50. That's plagued me for 40 something years. I mean, I cannot get my head around it. I never will be able to. I keep asking people if they've had similar experiences with similar characters. And then I come across that Stephen King story and I think, okay, well, maybe, as Chris said earlier on, maybe it is some sort of devil stereotype. I don't know, but I don't know what I did to deserve meeting him.
You left your toys out. That's what happened.
Yeah.
Mom and Dad got pissed off, and so after
you thought about supporting United for a second there.
That'll teach me.
After you saw this guy staring at you ravenously, did you run away or did you walk away? No, you said you ran away.
Yeah.
Right? You ran with a fever of you couldn't run fast enough.
Yeah. The experience lasted all of a couple of seconds. You don't want to stare at that for too long, believe me, whatever that was. And I just bolted. Like I said, I'm amazed I bolted. That other little experience from real life that I told you about, where my mother's friend came in and decided to play a prank on a child, I couldn't move. I was rigidly frozen to the spot. But this, I was, thank your chosen deity, I was able to move my feet and get away from it. And I'm very glad I did. I really feel like that I was probably seconds away from something really bad happening. That's how that felt.
Well, I'm glad you made it out, man. That's good. So after you ran home, did you kind of like lock the doors and look out the window, or did you kind of just go ignore it?
I babbled to my parents and they didn't believe a word of it. And, they were sufficiently removed from the old Ireland at that stage. They're very much in new 20th century, mid to late 20th century materialism, and they just weren't having any of it. And ironically, I think an awful lot of the reason why they weren't having any of it was because of their very, very staunch Catholicism, that things like that aren't real. And it is quite interesting. Like I said, there's an odd mix, an eclectic mix here in Ireland of people who can be simultaneously religious and suspicious. They have all the old pishoga, which are the superstitions about anything from like I said earlier on, tugging your forelock at a magpie, or perhaps old cures and remedies and stuff like that. People still have those very much at hand. I mean, I don't know if you guys have this tradition of old healing techniques, but when I was a kid, my dad brought me to a guy. Because I had two warts on two of my fingers, and Dad brought me to this guy because they wouldn't go away, and we had done whatever conventional medicine stuff, and he brought me to this guy who had the cure, right? And this is again just stuff we took for granted in Ireland. I'll explain the cure to you. So he goes out, he finds a snail. And again, trigger warning for any of you who are worried about animal welfare here, I'm afraid. He finds a snail. He impales the snail on a long thorn, and he makes the sign of the cross over my two fingers. Now, how screwed up is that? And what sort of a mix and gatherum of pagan and Christianity is that? Poor snail.
Well,
guys, it worked. It worked. It was gone in 2 days. So I don't know.
Trev, I wanted to segue into talking about some mythological creatures, or maybe some that you've probably were told about when you were younger. One in particular that's always caught my eye is the Fear Gortas. Is that how you say that?
Yeah, Far Goethe. Yeah.
Far Goethe. I look at my little Irish
Far Goethe.
The Far Goethe.
Your Irish is shite.
Yeah. So a far is a man, and Goethe is famine. So he's the famine man. So he's this starving, emaciated, gaunt, skeletal creature. And again, usually a sign of not good things, usually a bad omen, and always taking that shape of the absolutely borderline dead, emaciated man.
Is that something that is still commonly talked about, or that something you ever heard of growing up? It's like, oh, we've seen this, so shit.
No, honestly, I none of them really had the staying power of the Banshee that I can think of. Obviously, with the help of you guys over that side of the water, there's been an awful lot of leprechaun chat over the years. And honestly, the origins of leprechauns not quite as benign as the little chirpy pot of gold guys. You know, again, like all creatures, genuinely, the origins of them tend to be pretty dark. They're not the little, like fairies, for example. Fairies are huge in Ireland. They are the other big area that I would say, fairy and fairy culture. So around here we would have fairy forts and fairy rings and all that kind of stuff. And it's not a word of a lie that in the field across the way from me, in this lovely open expanse of mead grass, which is, you know, very famous for both tillage and dairy farming, you will find in the middle of these big expanses of grass a gnarly old tree on a little hillock. And that's because the farmer will not, for love or money, plough that into the ground. And you asked earlier on if any of these things linger. Well, there's an example, right? People just won't do it for fear of bad luck. So I guess they do. I guess maybe they might deny to themselves if you ever ask them, but these things never get touched. I mean, ever. But again, fairies, people think of Peter Pan and Tinkerbell and stuff like that, but fairies were vicious bastards, you know? Leprechauns were vicious bastards. And they were all, you know, incredibly self-interested. And I think an awful lot of the time, a lot of these creatures, especially the ones, you would have touched on some of them in your Halloween show, there's suggestions that they were perhaps powerful in some previous era or age, perhaps gods that have been, you know, sort of demoted and take on these kind of nasty, twisted, self-interested forms. But for sure, you don't want any interactions with fairies. You don't want to meet a freaking leprechaun. He's not bringing you wealth. That's basically. I think the reality of that was something I was very aware of growing up with. And I don't know which of you guys it is that likes to go off on the rant about do not fuck with Ouija boards.
Ouija boards.
Yeah,
that's Chris.
Me. That's me.
That's you,
me.
Chris. Right. So
Yes,
so
sir.
I've got a very similar attitude towards this type of thing. I get a sniff of that, I'm going in the opposite direction. I just don't want to know because it's scary, right? It's disconcerting and potentially dangerous. I don't want to borrow it. I agree with that idea completely. Why would you invite that shit into your life? Why would you do that? You would only do that if you've got a disregard for the potential that it has to screw up your existence. I think that might be a bit. I think that might be a bit foolish to have that view.
I actually blame Disney. The Disney Channel, because there's this movie, and I know neither one of you know this movie. Maybe
it better
Trev
not
could
be Luck
possibly.
of the Irish.
It's not.
Okay.
This movie came about, and I actually think it. Oh, who was the famous James Bond?
It's Darby O'Gill and it's Sean Connery.
Yes, Sean Connery, Darby O'Gill and Little People by Walt Disney was one of my favorite movies growing up. And crazily enough, the only time this movie comes up is when I'm talking about my experiences at my grandfather's cabin in the woods up there. And it's so funny how it comes full circle because Trev knows about it. It's got leprechauns. The leprechauns are like troublemakers. They're little drunkards, or at least the king was. But it was such a delightful, fun movie. and I love the concept of leprechauns because like when I was growing up, they were always kind of like this grandfatherly kind of playful, like they might give you a spanking, but they're not going to really hurt you that bad. And they're kind of like, just kind of, tongue in cheek. But then I got older and then I heard like these terrible stories about what true leprechauns are like. They're kind of like the djinn, Chris, like in Japan, or not the djinn, the what are those creatures called in Japanese culture?
The tengu?
The tengu. Yeah, they're like the tengu where they're very mischievous. Sometimes they they like might do a prank that's not really harmful, but sometimes they'll like kill people. Like they'll straight up like make something fall on someone's head and kill them. And then I heard like similar stories about leprechauns. So like, can we just dig really quickly into that, Trev? Like what was so nefarious about leprechauns? Like what are some stories about what they would do? How bad were they? And where do you think this idea of like they grant wishes and they're like at the end of rainbows, like where do you think that came from?
Well, so far as I understand, and by the way, I don't know if you've seen it, but I think it's something that would tie in nicely with your show. Have you seen the TV series made of Neil Gaiman's American Gods by any chance?
I've heard of it, but I don't really remember it. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so in that you've got a collection of all the sort of stereotypical characters from different parts of the world. So you've got a Norse god, you've got a leprechaun, you've got a djinn, and they all are interacting with each other in contemporary America and flitting back and forward between time and stuff like that. In it, you get sort of a little bit of an insight into some of the more, some of the less cliched aspects of of those entities. And again, it's interesting how many of them, like you say, Dean, are trickster entities, because that does seem to be a common theme throughout. As far as the leprechaun origin story goes and where it comes from, I think you'll find like an awful lot of these things, that the avarice and greed and money hoarding and all that kind of thing is just a common enough trait with any sort of solitary creature, and they are supposed to be solitary. They don't hang around in packs, sadly, like the happy-go-lucky chaps in Darby O'Gill. And I think that's where that comes from, and the idea of keeping an eye in your own corner. But they don't have the same darkness and threat as the fairies, which ironically seems quite ironic because most people think fairies are comparatively harmless. But here in Ireland, I mean, every single nasty thing that could happen was often attributed to fairies. For example, if your child is in some way not developing the way it should, the first suspicion that people used to have was that child was a changeling, which was a kind of facsimile of the child, the real child, which had been left there in place of the real child, which had been stolen. So fairies had this reputation for literally stealing and abducting children, and all sorts of nasty viciousness that leprechauns seem to have skated by without. Like I said, very much territorial, very much sort of associated with avarice and greed, like I said. But I don't think that's uncommon for solitary creatures, whereas these other sort of apparently harmless folk are the ones that really are up to the mischief, if that makes sense.
The idea of fairies as well, like you were saying, like the visions of them in Western culture or like American culture, they're very sparkly, shiny, somewhat attractive looking, beautiful young faces or whatever. I think I've seen in other portrayals, like more in line with what you're talking about, they're actually very haggard. They're ugly, and they're so small, but they're you don't want to be near them. They're very, they look very evil, so to speak. Chris, while you were gone, on the little break there, Trev mentioned this thing I wanted to bring up, and I think you probably did too, because you probably came across it in your research. But if I had to choose like the two craziest, creepiest stories in Irish culture, it would be the Banshee and the Changeling, or the idea of the Changeling. There was actually this movie. I don't know if it was an Irish movie or not. It came out recently. I can't remember. It was definitely made in another country, but it was called The Hollow, and it came out in 2015. It's essentially, getting along, playing at this whole idea of changelings. And I had never heard of changelings until I watched that movie, like probably like 9 or 10 months ago. I have a daughter, and she just turned 3. So like, that long ago, she was like 2, and she was going through the terrible 2 age. And I'm not, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I believe for a second that there was a, changeling thing going on, but I actually imagined how terrifying that would be. Like, imagine like you're, 100 years ago, and we're so far removed from anything that's modern, that resembles any modern technology. You're rural, you're in a time and a place where you're exposed to all these stories about mythical creatures and how they can come after you and hurt you, and you know about the changeling, and then your child starts acting differently suddenly, and they start acting out. Like first they were sweet and now they're just acting out. And it, of course, medically there could be any number of things going on. They could be going through some teething or whatever, like anything that might be upsetting them. They could change their attitude. But that idea of the changeling always terrified me, and I imagine it would be really terrifying back then too. And I would like to like kind of explore that, if you know any more about that, Trev. If you have a child, especially a very young child, these fairies or whatever, they would want to, they would like take your child away from you, and they replace the child with like a mimic form of your child. So it's not really your child anymore. It's like, I think it's like they one of the fairies take the form of your child, and then you inadvertently take care of that fairy, but it's acting out, it's monstrous, it's getting in trouble, and it's doing all these terrible things, and your child is lost, presumably forever. Trev, does that sound like a similar type of concept of what a changeling is? And is there anything else to add to that?
Absolutely. And it gets a bit grimmer actually, Dean, than that, because I think a sort of a comparatively common swap out word for changeling was either Auf or Oaf, and Oaf sounds pretty bad, as you can imagine, because the idea is that this creature that's left is more human-like than human. And in fact, some of them were referred to, if I recall correctly, as a stock, I think, because the idea being that they were more wooden and almost lifeless entities that were left. And I can tie it right back to the lady that started the podcast, because my granny told me about a fantastic story about this, that a neighbor of theirs, when she was very little again, around about that same time, a neighbor of theirs became convinced that she had had her child stolen by the fairies. And the kid that grew up, again, like you say, there's probably rational explanations in a lot of cases, maybe in all cases, for what has happened to them. Maybe some, advanced learning difficulties as they get older, maybe some sort of physical condition. But whatever it is, the idea is that the creature, for want of a better word, that is left, this is the mythology, is not, as you say, quite what it should be. And in some way, it's very obvious. And in some other stories, it's glaringly obvious to the extent that it doesn't even appear to be human. And this woman, a neighbour of my granny's, again, just from over the road in Meath, basically disowned this kid. And that's the dark side of this belief in these kind of stories. Never ever warmed to that child, never ever could embrace that child. And tragically enough, the kid did die quite young, and tragically enough, the kid was, for all intents and purposes, they didn't have the language back then to speak about it in any way politically correctly. So my granny just said the kid was never right, whatever that means. But I just thought it's interesting there that like it's never too far away from any family that there's this story that you've heard about, and that kind of, like I say, that kind of brings it full circle back to my granny and the Banshee. And by the way, you were saying about fairies, that's actually literally what Banshee means in Irish. Ban is woman, and she is fairy or fairy-like. So right there is another reason why you shouldn't be too won over by the idea of Tinkerbell when it comes to fairies,
Yeah, Trev, would you mention there that story of, your grandmother's neighbor thinking that my kid must have been swapped out by a changeling or something of that sort? I wonder if that's kind of like the main origin of it for families back in the day. Because if you think back to history, peasant families and families that had to till the fields and work for a living like every frickin' day, like if you didn't work, you didn't eat. They didn't want to deal with the burden of dealing with a child that was probably not physically stable or mentally unstable. So I wonder how far back that goes, that they could use that superstition as an excuse, to get rid of unwanted children. And that's the first thing that comes to mind, because nowadays, we have the ability to medically diagnose folks with whatever issue and condition that they might have. But back then it's easier to chop it up to, this is some sort of trick of like a fairy, or a fairy took my kid, and this isn't really my kid, so I don't love them anymore, I don't want anything to do with them, they could go off and die.
I think there's probably a huge amount of that because, so much of the topics that you guys cover, it's us telling stories to ourselves, isn't it, to explain the world. That's basically what we do. That's what different cultures do. And I know, because I've looked into this before, that I think in Norse traditions, they had a similar thing. And I think the twist on it was that the trolls they thought it was advantageous or somehow elevating to have their children raised by humans. So that is one of the stories there to explain why certain families think, oh, this kid's a troll, right? A changeling of some sort, a troll changeling. And then, there are other cultures as well. I mean, it always seems to be, doesn't it, that in some way the kid whatever difficulties that are going on with the kid are associated with, oh well, we must blame this on something else. And I think you could be spot on here, Chris, in that this could be one of those things that people use to explain things that they could not understand to themselves, or that life was too harsh to entertain to themselves. But it does go on. So if you ever want to have a look at a fantastic story about the changeling, there's an episode of, I think it might be the Lore podcast, which focuses on Bridget Cleary. Now that one is absolutely unbelievable. She was someone who grew to be an adult and ended up being killed by her husband in an attempt to try to force the fairies to return the real Bridget. So this is an example of, the same concept but transposed into an adult. And this again, what was happening there? Was this some guy who just got dissatisfied with his wife and decided that he was going to claim that she was a changeling? Well, it didn't end up very well for Bridget, I'll tell you that. The whole story is really, really grim. If you're looking for it, if you want to look it up later on, Bridget Cleary, Bridget, Cleary, Clearoy. It's a really good example of how crazy the belief in this can go.
Yeah, that's so crazy. And I had never heard of this story, but here it is. I just Googled it, and it's there's so much data about it. There's true crime it's in crime compilation. There's a YouTube remembrance documentary about her, but she was born in February 1869 and she was killed in March 1895 in Ireland. I could totally see doing an actual episode on this, because this is really fascinating, this sort of thing. And Chris, I don't know if you remember, but we actually talked about something similar to this in a past podcast. I think it was the episode we talked about like the Slender Man and the origins of the Slender Man, and it kind of ties back in a little bit to Trev's like the Man in Black, or the Man in Black from what was the writer's name?
Stephen King.
Thank you. Yeah. So the idea that like these origin stories, like this kid he disappears. They find this black cloth in the room, and the whole thing, and there's like a dead cow in the tree or something, like in mangled or something like that. And the whole story, the crux of the story, is that the family blames this mysterious creature / man who's dressed in black took their child away. But then we were kind of like postulating, like, I wonder, like, it must have been extremely easy back then. Like you had a child, maybe the child was sick with it, like, like the flu or something, or you couldn't feed them anymore. And then someone comes along and you just make up this tall tale about how they either died peacefully or they suddenly were absconded away. If there's any semblance of you did something wrong, all you would have to do is just raise this specter of fear around you about witchcraft or demons or spirits or whatever, and you would drastically increase your chances of getting away with it scot-free, which is kind of terrifying, as just as sad as it is terrifying of a concept.
Something, if you don't mind me jumping in here for a second, I've just thought of, and it explains a lot about the mentality I was raised in, because around here you're not allowed to praise yourself in any way, shape or form. It's very frowned upon to have even expressions of self-confidence, of any kind. We are a very if an Irish person sees you saying something positive about yourself, there's a good chance you are going to get the absolute piss taken out of you for a long time. And I think it's basically a cultural thing. And I just remember a little thing that I had heard in the past, that it was dangerous. Again, when this belief in fairies was rife, it was dangerous for people to admire the beauty of young babies, or even, I think, it got in the state, perhaps the case of Bridget Cleary, for example, a young woman, to cast admiring glances or make admiring comments. This is dangerous because apparently it would draw the attention of the fairy folk and make them a desirable target. It's not really interesting in that, like, if you wanted to just do a nuts and bolts thing, you could say, well, maybe that explains why we're so reluctant to praise each other around these parts, because you don't want to be giving the fairies ideas. I just think that's really good. It just like I say, it just kind of fits in with what you were saying.
That's also a fascinating connection to the human psyche in and around a culture that is kind of, like you said, it took longer to develop in Ireland and stuff like that. So there's this permeation of the concept that we need to do things to, because I mean, like, let's be honest, like, Ireland went through some shit. You had the famine, and you had the rule of England and stuff like that, and all that crap, like, hovering over the country for years and years, and the ire of the IRA and all that stuff, like, so, like, a lot of shit swirling going on in Ireland. And I can just envision, like, that's why it's so unique in so many ways, culturally, psychologically. And it'd be interesting to kind of tie in this idea that, like we said earlier, religion is a big part, and it's actually Irish Catholic, or Roman Catholic is like the big religion there. And I actually Googled this before we got on. It's actually 78% of Irish people identify as Roman Catholic, which to me sounds like an extremely significant number of the population. But then, like you said, Trev, there's also an air of this ancient culture, this paganism is still floating about. So I feel like if you're ever going to get a place that is so unique that, like, psychologically and spiritually, it's going to be a place like Ireland. I always wondered about paganism, like what. So I imagine, like, people who are very staunchly Catholic in Ireland, like, they don't really look too kindly on paganism and stuff like that. But, like, what's the general cultural thought about paganism? Is it like does it lean more towards the evil side, like it's mostly associated with negative witchcraft and evil things, or is it kind of like neutral, or is it kind of like, oh, it's actually kind of like an old beautiful religion that's tied to, like, Gaelic culture, or if anything, if that makes sense?
Well, I think as an old dude, Gen X person, I'm probably pretty well positioned to answer that, because over the course of my lifetime, we've gone from that more, at least, openly devout Catholic majority through all the troubles and difficulties with the church, that, is a very interesting topic in and of itself, and what that does to the psyche of a nation that's very strongly religious. Then we went into this period where I think in the last 20, 30 years, to call Ireland Catholic would be hilarious, because people might be culturally Catholic. They might, like myself, have been brought up Catholic, but the vast majority have no interest in that at all. I mean, when I was a kid, you would have young men coming round and doing various masses. When we were kids, mass was like an Olympic sport for my parents. It was remarkable, and they got into all that charismatic Christianity thing, fucking guitars and songs and hymns, and Jesus Christ, it was intense. It was intense.
Jesus Christ, where?
It was intense. So I mean, so I went from being immersed in that, and that was the tail end of it. Then, there's nothing. There's a vast nothingness here. Ireland is not a religious country anymore. And I think in the early parts of that, Dean, to answer your question, people embraced all that mythological stuff as part of some sort of funky Irish New Age stuff. I mean, I'm sure you've looked at the whole New Age thing, or will be considering it as part of your show's topics. I think it's possibly a dangerous enough path, that one. But it was part, and I think sort of folded in to the people who were going that. See, when I was in my 20s, you'd come across guys and they would be a fucking mess of patchouli and maybe Mexican ponchos and Celtic music and incense and joss sticks, and it was just a mishmash of all different types of things, to the extent that people pass through that, and I don't think it's a thing anymore. Ireland, even to say it's culturally Catholic is a stretch. It's really different place now. In fact, if you look at legislation and you look at the way things are moving culturally in this country, politically in this country, we are right at the forefront, I would say, alongside the likes of Canada, in terms of, well, it's not a direction I'm openly embracing, but it's very much along what people call, in inverted commas, liberal thinking. So we've lost all that. We've lost all of that, and that generation, I think my generation's the last generation who's going to have any sort of semblance of understanding about superstition and that aspect of our culture.
Trev, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned New Age and whatnot with regards to beliefs. I wanted to get your general opinion on what your thoughts are on, the younger generation delving into neo-paganism, essentially practicing Wicca and trying to get into all of this Celtic paganism. And you'll find it a lot more so over here. I'm not sure what the environment is like in Ireland with that whole new wave stuff, but you do find it a lot in the United States. And one thing I'll always say is that, yeah, that's fine. Do what you want. We have the freedom to do whatever the hell we want to do. You want to worship whatever the hell you want to worship. But when people are doing that, there is kind of a little bit of a disconnect, because you're jumping right into it without that connection of the previous generations that have more of an understanding of what that was and what the potential negative outcomes could be. Because let's be honest, the whole fucking reason we're on this podcast today is not because fairies and leprechauns and the Banshee is going to come down and give you fucking chocolates and a pot of gold. That's not why we're talking about them. Yeah. We're talking about them because of the horrible interactions that you could potentially have that could take your life or affect someone else's life. So what are your thoughts on people that like to dive into this new wave, not really have an understanding of where it comes from? Yeah, you can understand the history. Like me as a historian, I understand, I love Roman history. I understand the worship of Ares. I understand the worship of Zeus, Jupiter, whatever the hell you want to call them. But I'm not going to go and start sacrificing rams without knowing what the potential ramifications would be. But
oh shit, that was a good one, man. I like that.
Nice
one.
Stupid dad joke, but you get what I'm trying to say, Trev. I feel like I'm stumbling over my words.
And just to add on to that real quickly, I also read, I don't know if you saw the same article, Chris, but that's interesting you bring that up, because I just saw an article yesterday or something that was talking about this rejuvenation of interest in paganism. And it all started with I don't remember the horror movie. There's some movie apparently that had really weird, creepy stuff happening in it, and that people still glommed onto it, and they are romanticizing the idea of paganism. And I tend to agree with you, Chris. Messing with shit that you don't really understand and trying to make connections to the past without having that direct connection is kind of dangerous. I think that's kind of probably how you get this new evolution of religion coming about. Maybe this is the apex of a new type of religion coming about that we'll see in the next few hundred years. But yeah, I'll flip it back to Trev. What's your perspective on this whole new age shift in this integration of paganism, this rejuvenation?
I would think about it like I think about everything else. If you're just LARPing, then you're in danger. And the reason I say that is because exactly what Chris said. If you're going to engage with something like that, you should understand how you at least protect yourself, how you begin by protecting yourself, by fully understanding what it is. And Chris, as a historian, is going to get into a little bit of detail and understand something in a way that possibly an awful lot of these people who are flirting with these things don't. And, I think you take it seriously or you risk danger. I'm all for experiencing and experimenting with whatever you want to do, and I'm not here to tell people how to live their lives or behave in any way, but my take on it has always
I
been,
agree. I agree.
You let people off, right, Chris? And I think I've heard you say that you you have a certain amount of faith. I can't remember if you said whether you're devout or not, but I know you at least you have that background. I think you still have some of it. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm still a believer in a higher power. I mean, I'm not the greatest Catholic, but if you listen to the previous episodes where I hear bits and pieces, I talk about what I experienced growing up with regards to like the negativity. And the one example I like to give, I literally saw my aunt get pushed into a closet door, like lifted off the ground and pushed into a closet door. And
Yeah.
I have no fucking scientific explanation for that, but that's where it comes from. At first, I was an atheist, and then you see something like that, I'm like, okay, if there's something negative that's doing that shit, there has to be something on the other side, you know, that's on the side of good. But I'll digress.
Well, that's exactly where I go with it. So you could have seen me making that obvious cliched run away from the hyper Catholic background that I had and dive into full blown atheism, like most people seem to do, because it was trendy, you know, and it ties in very much with the scientific materialism that's so popular at the moment. Like every talking head that's vaguely academic seems to believe in that, you know, we're all, you know, meat suits, you know, robots roaming around in a meaningless universe. You have your time and then it's done. And I could never embrace that either. So I never went down the atheist route. I was never as devout as I should have been when I was a kid as a Catholic. I could see the appeal of the pagan thing, and the way it tied into history and mythology made me really, really fascinated by it. But you know, I've always had the ability to do, whether it's last year when I got 3/4 of the way through a book about Aleister Crowley and went, that's enough. I've always known when to put on the brakes and just say, I don't like the way this is going. And I heard someone on your show there recently talking about a YouTube clip that was in Latin and it was being repeated, and you know they only came to understand what it meant afterwards. You see, that would happen to me. I would see it and I go, nope. And that's the sort of defense mechanism that I've had built in to me since that fucking weirdo at the bottom of my garden, that evil presence. I have never ever embraced anything fully. It makes me sort of this liminal creature. I don't adhere to any one particular belief system or view of the world. And for me, that's healthy. I understand other people get tremendous solace in faith. My dad does. I get that. For me, that's not an option. You know, I mean, I certainly can't do the one I was from. You know, you saw something remarkable, Chris, that made you think there's something more to life than this. I also saw firsthand some of the pretty much horrific stuff that you can experience through being exposed to the Catholic Church, you know, with the experiences some of my friends had, you know, understanding things that happen to family with mother and baby homes and stuff like that. That kind of dark stuff just leaves a mark on you. You can't ever go back and embrace that. So I understand people wanting to go and experiment with anything. And like I said, I'm not here to put a limit on anyone and their exploration. But I would always say, try to have that sort of, if it starts to feel wrong, it's wrong. You know, if the guy with the mad eyes starts to look evil, he's evil. So go away and stop being part of that thing and break that cycle. Too many people just sort of stay there apathetically and get hooked into stuff that, you know, you don't want to be part of.
I think the tricky thing too, though, I would caution about, and I know this, I'm speaking to all of us, to the three of us, it's going to be blatantly obvious, but I wanted to put it out there to any listeners that I think it's, and it'd be interesting to get everyone else's perspective, but like, I think it's interesting that you can also go too far in that direction that you're talking about, Trev. Like I can envision a moment in time, and we've seen this in the past, but like someone focuses too much on what they think or perceive as being evil. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and discount your experience, but I know that there are other people who have experiences where they look at someone and they think, oh, that person's evil, that person's bad, and or that person's associated with witchcraft or whatever. And then like you could see where I'm going with this full circle. Like if you actually give into that and you turn away, then I think that's kind of like a shift back to this individualistic society, to the point where you ignore everybody else because there's less trust or there's more mistrust and uncertainty that is built on the foundation of the idea that there's this unknown spirituality side to nature, to things that are going on around us that we can kind of understand, and we try to understand, and we think we understand, and then we superimpose that on experiences. And the best we can do is try to interpret them based off of that spiritual nature. If you kind of like tie it back into this idea that, like, let's say you're looking at some homeless dude who is looking at you, and you, for some reason, you just get an evil sense from him, but maybe that person has no evil intent in them whatsoever. It could be that they do, but if they don't, you're kind of like shutting yourself off from that freedom of kind of being more brave, approachable to a certain situation, and kind of opening yourself up more about it. So I don't know. That's just something that I had to drop in there that popped into my head.
Do you mind if I just respond to that? Because I think it's a good point you make, and nobody wants to maroon themselves sort of solitary and judgmental island. That's not really what I was getting at. What I was getting at was that people should probably trust their instincts. I've had very good experience of being right when I've trusted my instincts, not in the way that, business jerks do, who make decisions based on their instincts and make loads of money. I don't.
We're talking to you, John W. Henry.
yeah, right, exactly. That's not my forte. I'm coming more and more around to the belief that, in the vein of what we've been talking about, these sort of things that you can't explain. If you have a feeling, it's possibly always a good idea to trust it. People don't talk about gut feelings for nothing. And we're only now, in the last while, starting through, the wonder that is science, to understand that there is almost like a second brain in the gut where you can have these instinctual responses and the explanation for them. That's all I was getting at. Like, in life, in theory, the way I would suggest approaching things is the way I approach my Twitter feed, because I follow a lot of people, and they all have something nice about them. But most of the time, I'm rolling my eyes and deciding not to engage in whatever opinion is being expressed that I cannot in any way relate to or warm to or agree with. But that does not mean that you cut that person out of your life or whatever. It's just a matter of, okay, dude, you can think that, you can be that, you can, that can be your version of events. And it doesn't mean that we're exclusively separated. So I fully get the point you're making, Dean. I like to think you can still keep connections, but also maybe trust your gut when it comes to feeling a little bit uneasy. Like I said, just simple things. Like I've got this amazing collection of books that I've built up over the years. And a couple of them, I've only gotten about half or three quarters of the way through because I thought, I don't feel good about this. I might be. One I was reading, it was about Madame Blavatsky, who I'm sure you've heard of. Maybe you've done a show on, I don't know. And I got to a certain point where they were talking about this sort of belief system and the ideas behind it and the values behind it. And I just went, geesh, I got a really bad feeling and I just stopped. I guess that's what I'm talking about. Whereas personal exposure to things that I've had enough of that now, that kind of built-in defense mechanism. That's really all I was saying.
No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. All right, so this is awesome. Kind of discussed this offline, but Trev has been gracious enough to give us some more of his time. And we're actually going to do a slightly longer episode because we came across some Irish lore and some concepts that we want to explore that are fascinating that Chris and I had never heard of and Trev knows a lot about. So before we kick into that, I would like to ask Trev his insight into this. So I only have two whiskeys. I have Maker's Mark whiskey, and I'm sure that's shite. And I have Talisker single malt Scotch whiskey, which I just found out is Scottish, not Irish. So you probably think that's shite. And then I just got good old Jägermeister. So which one would you choose, Trev? Which one should I? Are they just all piss water or what?
No, man. No. That's I'm not half as snobby as some people might think. I'll tell you, I do have a preference when it comes to whiskies, and I get dog's abuse for this as a cultural Catholic, because the one I go for is the most Protestant drink of all, Bushmills. And Bushmills is a very, very, very Protestant whiskey.
Bushmills.
Yeah, I love it. Bushmills Black Bush specifically. I do love that. However, if I was you, I'd pour a big old Maker's Mark there, man. I actually like that. I like it a lot.
Awesome, man. Okay, I'm actually going to have to look up that Black Bush too, because that sounds delicious.
Oh, dude, it's excellent. It's tremendous.
What we're going to pick up on, we discovered through discussion from here. So there's one topic that I'm going to try to pronounce again. I'm sure I'm going to do a crappy job at it. But so the Tuatha De Danann. And that apparently opened up a whole box of interest from Trev, because he knows a lot about it. When he was describing the mythology and all the levels of like the godlike individuals, good and bad, and there was talk of weaponry, and I'm like, okay, I saw Chris's ears perked up, and ancient battle. Holy shit, get into that. So let's do that. Let's explore this. Can you tell us, Trev, like give a brief synopsis of the Tuatha De Danann?
So, yeah, of course I can. It's involved. And so if you are actually a mythological scholar, just give me a break, will you? Because there's a lot of stuff here. There are a lot of plates spinning. But the Tuatha De Danann, the way you break it down in terms of the meaning of the words in Irish, and I probably should have mentioned this at some stage, but I am actually not just a native speaker, but I actually do teach the language as well. And there are very few of us that are actually fluent in this country in our own language, which is a weird thing, a sad thing, but it's true. And the way Tuatha De Danann breaks down, Tuatha is like a tribe or a people. And then De can be of God or of. And then Danann is, probably a reference to Danu. And Danu was this sort of mother goddess, real archetypal kind of a goddess. In Irish mythology, she's kind of an obscure figure. Like she has certain associations with fertility and all those kind of things that most of those mother type goddess characters do. But again, seems to be one of the most preeminent ones, one of the originators, one of the earliest gods in terms of Gaelic culture. And the Tuatha De Danann then would be often translated as the people of this goddess, the tribe of this goddess. And, they have to say there's a lot going on in this is an understatement. Like I said, I'll try and break it down so people can have a few little things to go and look up. This is all I'm doing because I don't want to try to, I don't even want to pretend to try to retell the tales or anything. But one of the original things I'd heard about the Tuatha De Danann was there are these incredible sort of beautiful godlike tribe. They're noted for their beauty. They're noted for the fine precision of their weaponry, and they battled with characters who were very different. You might have heard of the Fomorians, and they are kind of a giant tribe who were associated with the sea, who were a lot more kind of rough and ready, and they battled with the Tuatha De Danann. Within this battle, there was another crew of people called the Nemedians from the King Nemed, and people fled. This is formative Irish mythology. These groups fled. Some of them fled around the various parts of the world and went and gathered various skills, knowledge, that type of thing. They went to 4 of the great cities of the north. And again, I had to look up, I don't even know where all of these are. Phalius was one, Gorius, Phineas, Murius. And in each one of these cities, they add to their understanding of the world, to their knowledge, their knowledge of the science of the time, their knowledge of the weaponry of the time, craftsmanship, learning from wise men and sages. And they return. And their return, it comes with a lot of drama and an awful lot of further battles within the history of the country itself. Now, sorry, within the mythology of the country itself. In this massive battle, the king of the Tuatha De Danann has his hand cut off. And you like this detail, lads, because he has his hand cut off. he's not beautiful or perfect enough anymore to be king. And I just think, in the age of participation medals, that shows you how different life used to be, how different expectations were. So this guy has to stand down as king. And he's replaced by this warrior called Bress. And Bress is half Tuatha and half that other crowd I mentioned earlier on, Fomorian. And he allows them back in. He allows them to extract taxes. And of course, inevitably, there's another battle. The Tuatha Danann finally do get some sort of ascendancy. And one of the sort of gods within the group, one of the real figureheads of the group, was a character called Diancecht. And he was a craftsman who made a silver arm for the king Nuada, and he was able to retake his position at the head of the Tuatha Danann. But the thing I was saying to you earlier on that I really loved, when they were off on their little hunter-gatherer expedition, traveling the cities of the north and gathering their information, they brought back to Ireland these wonderful symbols of their learning. One was the cleave Sulish, and that translates cleave as sword and Sulish is of light. Possibly the sword of destiny is something else, another symbol people might have heard of in the past in other cultures. They also brought back the cauldron of Daida, and that is this bottomless cauldron from which you could feed an absolute host of people. They also brought the Shla Bua, and a Shla is like a spear or a pike of some sort. Bua means gifted, so it's like this magical spear. And all of those things, if you think about it, they have an awful lot of equivalence in other cultures. But my favorite thing that they brought back with them, I think I mentioned it earlier on because it's right down the road from me on the top of the hill of Tara, and it's called the Lia Foil, which was the stone of destiny. And this stone, and like I say, I can literally get in my car, go 5 minutes, walk up to the top of the hill of Tara, and I'm right there beside it, which I often do. This stone would roar out when the rightful king stood upon it or touched it. You're looking for meaty mythology, interesting little tales and weaponry and devices, and that kind of stuff that knocks me over. I thought you might enjoy those few things anyway.
Well, now we know where you got your strange powers and your mystical experiences from. You got too close to that rock. You got too close to the rock, man.
Yeah,
did you hear it cry out? Did you? That'd be so funny. Like if you like went up to the rock. I didn't shout.
Nah.
I was gonna say, like, imagine what if you like went up to the rock and like you heard it shout and you like you know it was clearly like you heard something and you're not crazy, but there was no one else around to hear it, and then you try to bring people around the rock, like, no, listen, it did it. Like, I swear to God, I'm the king. I swear, kill this man, tar and feather him, and that's how we lost all of our kings.
I think I like your timeline better, especially if it makes me some sort of high king creature in the middle of that. I'm all for it. Yeah, if Aaliyah Falls shouts in the forest, will anybody hear? I don't know.
I want to ask real quick. By the way, I apologize in advance. I know we're talking over each other a little bit awkwardly, but there's some delay, and I imagine it has to do with the great distance that our technology has to travel to get to you out there. But so we're going to try to link it up as best as possible, but apologies to the listeners if there's any like overlap or whatever. But one thing I wanted to ask Trev real quick, because I've always been curious about this and I just don't have the time to delve deeply into Irish history, even though I would love to. What exactly is meant by Gaelic? Because I always thought Gaelic was a language, which I know it is. It also sounds like it's interchangeable with like a type of culture or people. Is there like one lump of Irish culture that fits into the Gaelic narrative? Or is there any like answer you can give me that we don't have to like go down a crazy rabbit hole?
It's the culture entire, if you want to think about it that way. It's the entirety of Celtic culture, essentially. And so therefore, when I went to college in TCD to study English, I had to study another subject for a while. So obviously I took my own language because I knew it. And part of that language was looking at the Scots Gaelic, which is the Scottish equivalent of the tongue that I speak, my native tongue. So it's kind of Celtic language, Celtic culture. Mainly, you're talking about Scotland and Ireland, and Gaelic with an E, Gaelic, has become almost associated exclusively with Ireland. Like I say, a kind of a blanket term to describe the language and the culture is probably the best way to understand it.
No, that's super fascinating. I always wonder too, like the overlap of Scotland and how the histories played off of each other. But I imagine, I mean, I know we don't have to go too deep into this because I do want to stay on topic of the what we were just talking about, the Tuatha De Danann. But just briefly, before I forget, is there any? What's the general overlap with Scotland in terms of like lore and history? If you know anything about that, I know you guys have some distance between you, but and I know there's some, maybe some kind of snickering, headbutting going on between Scottish and Irish. But like, is there any kind of like overlap that you're aware of in terms of lore and stuff like that? Do they have similar lores, just like they have kind of like almost like similar ancient language roots?
Oh, 100%. I mean, think about something we spoke about earlier on, the fairy mythology. An awful lot of that stuff carries over. And obviously, because there is this sort of shared language root, there's a lot of terminology as well that crosses over. It doesn't hurt that you can actually row a rowboat from a point there at the north of Ireland across to a point in Scotland. That's how close we are, really. It's not a considerable distance at all. So you're looking at two places that were eminently travelable to from each other. And just like we got old St. Patrick from Wales, we absolutely do have a huge amount of the Scottish shared mythology and shared ideas and shared cultural points. And even, I mean, if you were to hear the languages, if you were to hear the accents, the crossovers are bananas. Really, it's very, very similar. We do all sound quite guttural and throaty, and there's those similarities in that respect. But in terms of what we're talking about here, that shared mythology, like I say, I've exchanged stories with Scottish guys about fairy forts and fairy culture and all that kind of stuff, and how they're nasty, vicious little bastards, and they're nodding their heads along. They've heard similar stories. I think maybe where it gets down into the weeds a little bit, I would suggest that we're probably as a race a lot more overtly superstitious, and that's just from the people I know. I haven't spent much time in properly rural areas of Scotland where that could be the case, but I think the Irish are just possibly that little bit more immersed in all that stuff, and as a result sort of wear it in a way that perhaps the Scots don't. But that's just my personal take.
So Trev, at the end there, you mentioned fairy forts. Like, please go into that further.
Right, so this is what I was referring to earlier on when I was talking about the little mounds or hillocks in the fields, where there's usually some sort of a gnarly old tree growing from it as well. And the belief was that in these sort of little mounds, it's where the fairies would live, and therefore you touch them at your peril. You don't interact with them, you don't engage with them if you can avoid it at all. And the idea, of course, then is that, you would think in 2024, people don't take that type of thing seriously. But I'm looking at high-end farm machinery going past me here every day, combines and big John Deere tractors and plows. No fucker is touching one of those ever. They just stay there, and they're so anomalous looking because the feature of the county that I live in here, the old home of the High Kings, is flat green land, right? That's why the High Kings were based here, because we have the richest kind of land when it comes to tillage farming and dairy farming. So you've got these flat pastures everywhere, and these anomalous hillocks and mounds in them, with these gnarly little trees, sometimes two in a massive, massive field, and no one touches them. They will not get ploughed up. I love that about Ireland in 2024, that people still have that lingering residual fear that they don't want to mess with the fairy folk.
I think it's really funny that when I hear stories like this, I think about like I envision someone from like a New York wrecking team, like a New York City wrecking team, come like, hey, come on, guys, let's get in here, fuck the ferries, let's go, come on. Sorry, that sounded really bad. I'm literally talking about the mythical creatures. Okay, let me just be clear about that for a second. We're talking about mythical creatures, but like imagine if they came in the wrecking crew from New York City, they didn't give two shits about actual mythical fairies. They would just come in and knock the trees over. And I always like think about like the guys who go down to the Amazon rainforest and they're constantly knocking down like miles of rainforest every day, like thousands of workers that come from different countries. They have no regard or even knowledge about the culture whatsoever. And it always seems like those people never get the negative ramifications of such things. It's always the people who seem to believe. So that kind of takes me back to the original concept we've said in previous podcasts, which is like, to what degree, like paying awareness or homage or whatever, even if you kind of think there's an inkling of truth about something paranormal, does that automatically give more power to the thing that can target you? Or do you guys think that, and we can stick to the Irish perspective, but like, do you think, Trev, like if someone showed up who didn't have any knowledge whatsoever about fairies or banshees or anything like that, and they go knocking down trees, do you think it's just as likely that something crazy and strange would happen to that person who's from a different country, who doesn't know the culture? Or do you think that there has to be some kind of like blood connection or at least cultural connection to the area in order for something to materialize?
So I think you've driven the bus right back into the corner of the car park that's entitled Faith and Belief. And I think probably if you are oblivious to a myth or a set of legends or ideas, then possibly you blunder on past and maybe put down some misfortune to misfortune. Of course, we all are aware, we've seen stories about how you definitely don't want to go digging up ancient American Indian burial sites, how you don't want to bring back strange looking amulets from, somewhere where the Incas once were. We all know that you don't mess with that type of stuff, and that's kind of obvious. But in terms of whether the New York wrecking crew would find themselves accursed immediately, again, I think it comes back down to faith and belief. Some of them will be completely oblivious. Some of them will hear about it afterwards and feel wary. Some of them will then attribute some misfortune to that thing. And you see where I'm going with this, Dean. We're right back to the, how much do you believe in this thing? Again, to get back on my little hobby horse, I'm a real believer that we're sort of co-creators of our own reality. Anyone who's got even a passing interest in things like, I'm sure you've looked at like the double slit experiment, or the idea of the observer effect, and how intention matters, right? So if you don't believe, then you're not investing that intention. And I think an awful lot of it comes down to that idea of, like I say, being a co-creator of your own reality. And maybe we've got to a situation where me now, when I'm walking down the hall like I was last night and like you were recently, and I get this chill because like I said, I'm 50, right? If I bump into a guy in the street who's twice my size and he's rude, I will try to kill him. I have no fear of anything like that. But the unknown, that chill that I get in the back of my neck, that just, I basically broke into a skip last night as I moved down from my kitchen because I was convinced there was something behind me. And I don't know what that is or why I'm unfortunate enough to have to put up with it, but there it is. And that's me believing that kind of thing could happen. So I guess in a roundabout way, I might have answered your question there.
Yeah, absolutely. And be careful what you mention on this podcast, because if you bring up something really nerdy, I will eat that shit up like a hungry fish, because you talked about the slits experiment or whatever. Like I have not heard that brought up in a while. And that is something that I came across years and years ago, like closer to my youth. And if you're not familiar, I think I'll probably do a terrible job of explaining it, but essentially with it's the measurable move at quantum mechanics of a like a particle. And the measurement goes, it's like you're trying to figure out the patterns of particles that go between two slits and they land in a certain pattern on the other side. Theoretically, it should match the openness of the slits that exist, right? But what we see is we see almost like a quantum entanglement where there's a superposition of 2 points existing at the same time until there is like a landing on the page or something like that. So I always found that is just a fascinating concept of metaphysical reality, where we start getting into this whole concept of metaverse and multiple different realities layered on top of each other and branching off. And I think, Trev, you brought it up from your dream experience where you saw the petals in your dream, and then there was someone, and you experienced it in real life. There was actually someone in there like messing things up and ran out the door, and there's nothing to explain that. But like you were saying, how, that could have possibly been not necessarily supernatural, but some kind of bleeding over from another reality into this reality. And then also, to kind of tie that back into the mythical side, we were also kind of playing around with this idea that the mythical creatures can not only travel through multiple points in space, they can also travel through multiple points in time. And they can choose where to inhabit as a spirit entity or whatever, leprechauns, banshees, or whatever. They can choose to go to those different points. So it's, who knows? It's totally within the realm of possible that some kind of entity that can traverse multiple layers of reality can either exist in multiple points at the same time, or choose which point it wants to exist in and interact with the three-dimensional creatures like us are bound to this point in space time. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, and way to make me nerd all over the podcast.
Sorry, Chris. Yeah, but listen, I think once you expose your mind to the fact that the simple act of observing some sort of quantum property can change it, that when you are not observing, it's in a wave form, and then when it's observed, it's in a particle form, and nobody can explain that. And it's as if, like I said, the simple act of observation changes the reality of that situation. Once you accept that into your life, that's more impactful to me than any religious experience I've ever had, because that is a beautiful affirmation to me of the fact that, we don't know everything, and we don't understand our own reality, and we have to be open to it. And you guys over there have these wonderful places like, Skinwalker Ranch, and there are all these wonderful. Did you guys do an episode on was it the Wendigo? Did you do that?
Yes,
did you do one on that?
The Skinwalkers and the Wendigo.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there are all these wonderful, wonderful, liminal space creatures and entities that exist all over cultures, all over the world. And that's the thing about, I really, really am interested in with the Irish angle as well. An awful lot of them appear to exist very powerfully around water, sometimes rail, but also water, because they are these sort of energetic spaces. And also, these liminal spaces, where potential portals or whatever can open up, as you said earlier on, Dean, where one reality can bleed into another. And it seems to be a common enough trait across these stories, across cultures.
So yeah, this is a great segue, I think, to, we'll shift over to asking you, Trev, about Rassel, the mythical island that is supposedly, at least at one point, was near Ireland. It's surrounded by water, and it's just a very mythological and fascinating place to talk about. But can I just say very quickly, well, just to touch on the metaphysical discussion for 1 second, I've always wanted to bring this up on the podcast, and I can't think of another time I could do it other than this time. So you guys are familiar with Schrodinger's cat, right? The whole theory of Schrodinger's cat. You put a cat in the box and you release poison in it, and there, the cat is both superposition of alive and dead before you collapse the wave function, open the box, and you see whether the cat is still alive or dead. I personally think that's in the same vein as, like, if you're not around in a forest and a tree falls, does it make a sound because there's no one around to hear it? I personally think that concept and the concept of Schrodinger's cat is just the biggest pile of shit and the most human centric idea ever that we are so special that we have to have a conscious around something for it to actually be happening. So it's like if you took all the consciousness of humans out of reality and there was no other consciousness, would reality still exist? Of course it would still exist. It would still be in the state. There would still be sound waves that travel through the forest when a tree hits the ground. And just because there's no one there doesn't mean that it doesn't make a sound. And the same thing with the cat. If there's poison in a box and the cat trips, there's a 50-50 chance that the poison breaks loose and the cat dies or stays alive. That cat in the box is still alive or dead at that moment, regardless of whether or not someone looks in the box. So I might have missed the point on that completely, but I always thought that Schrodinger's cat was bullshit. So, and it sounds like, Trev, you have a lot of knowledge about stuff like this. So what is your quick perspective on that?
Wow. Around here when we were growing up playing football, there was a term where someone would give you a hospital pass. And that really feels like one of those to me, because I'm like...
Take this complicated concept. Trev, you just sound like you're so knowledgeable, so I just had to throw it your way.
Oh God! Don't cut it out. It's fantastic. This is listen. This kind of this is where I'm at. My happy place. And again, like I say, disclaimer: not an expert in anything, but the superposition thing is, logically, when it's explained out to you, you can understand where people are going with that concept, and it's one of those mind blowers that when you're 19, you just go, whoa, that's just, and then I think, as you say, we all attribute our own sort of current belief system to things as we go. Just now, that type of thing I'm finding fascinating. The observer effect I'm finding fascinating. That phrase I used before, and this is where I want to just jump back in on what you were saying about how I currently believe that I'm probably, to a greater or lesser extent, probably much lesser than I'd like, a co-creator of my own reality, right? If I accept that as a case, and that's going to probably rub people up the wrong way, and I don't mean to do that, but that's just where my current mindset is at. If I do accept that, well, then I've got to accept... Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So if I do accept that, then I've got to accept that, the truth of the observer effect, the fact that, this is just a little pushback against what you were saying there, Dean, that, well, maybe there is no fucking sound when the tree falls in the forest. I understand what you're saying from a scientific perspective. Yeah, exactly. But if the wave is two dots, like little BBs when I look at it, and it's a wave when I don't look at it, well, what does that mean? What's happening in the forest when the tree's falling? Of course, I'm oversimplifying here, but in that concept of co-creation of your own reality, I think it becomes very fascinating. And I understand where you're going with it. Like, where do people get off with their self-centered, human-centric, solipsistic view of the world? Like, if I'm not here, it all falls apart. I completely agree with you. But there's also that other aspect to it too, and I could be wrong, but doesn't that tie us nicely into the idea of an imaginary island? Is it there? Or is it only there if you look at it? Or is it there because it's on a map? So if you want, I can jump into high.
Don't lie, you're actually podcasting from there, aren't you?
But seriously, like those are all great points, Trev. Like I don't want to pretend for a second like I'm completely against any concept that, like, the wave functions, they act differently when someone's not around. I completely agree that that's within the realm of possible, and we could even say, with the island of Brassel, maybe it's the opposite of what we see. Like, okay, so in order to hear a sound, you have to be near the thing that falls in the forest. But maybe Brassel was the other side, where anyone who gets close to it, any three-dimensional creature who gets close to it, it disappears because it needs no one to interpret it in order for it to exist. So I don't know. That's just my kind of antithesis for that. But let's jump into the Brassel Island.
Yeah, look at you with the perfect podcast segue. That's perfect. And that's always been my take on it as well, to be honest, is that the way the stories around it are, it seems as if if it gets spotted, it's like, yikes, and it just jumps back into the mist. Because the concept, just to break it down for people who've never heard of this before, is that it is, if you look it up on Wikipedia, it'll probably say a mythical place. Now, I'm just going to push back slightly against that eventually, but the gist of it is that it's this island off the west or southwest coast of Ireland, depending on the map. And it is in the Atlantic Ocean, therefore, obviously, on the way across to you guys, off the west or southwest or northwest, depending on the map of Ireland. There are some myths about it, but not really that many, not as many as you would think, which again adds to the mystery of it. And the way the name is supposed to come from, Brassel is a kind of traditional Irish name. And Brassel, that's U-I with a little accent over it, we call it a fada, would be of Brassel. So the idea then was that this was a land or an island that was owned by, dominated by, run by this Brassel clan. Okay, so that's basically where the name comes from. I remember when I heard it first, it was High Brazil is the way I pronounced it, and because that's the way it was spelt in the thing that I read, and I went, wow, what connection have we got to a giant country in South America? But no, this is actually from an Irish name. That's the origin of it. And there's also the suggestion that it could be Brazil wood or Brassel wood, which is also possibly where the name comes from too. The thing about this land is it existed in mist, and it would be cloaked in that mist all the time, except for one day every 7 years. Now, one of the many things we could have touched on this show was the significance of 7. Because you remember that guy I told you, I'll try and do my own bit of podcast host, the magic here. Now, remember that guy I told you about, the guy with the snail on the thorn? He was the 7th son of a 7th son, right? That's what that guy was. And the significance of that number is obviously, in mythology, is obviously huge. 3 and 7 are massive in Irish mythology, absolutely huge. Every historical or every mythological story, whether it's Fionn McCool or Cuchulainn or any of these stories of the great Irish heroes of the past, 3s and 7s all the time. And here's this land that appears one day every 7 years from out of the mist. And I just absolutely love the concept. Now, just to get into why it's worth bringing up at all, it's on maps. It's on nautical charts. It's on a map from 1375, a Catalan atlas. It's on the famous Piri Reis map from 1513. Graham Hancock refers to the Piri Reis map quite a lot in his new book, America Before. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with Graham's work. Whether you're fans or not, you'll be aware of it. But that Piri Reis map is a very real nautical map. It's on a map of Europe from 1570. It's on another one mentioned by Hancock and several others, the Mercator map, as late as 1595, if you can believe that. And there were actual expeditions that went looking for this island, I think, in the late 1470s or maybe 1480, which left England from, I think it was Bristol, looking for this island, and several other expeditions. There was one in the sort of 1670s with another British captain who went to try and find this place, because it's on maps, lads. That's why. And never could it be found. And that, of course, adds to the mystery. So what happened there? Was it something that was a geographical formation that for some reason got subsumed beneath the waves? And it's hefty, lads. It's a big old island. When you see it in comparison with Ireland, it's a big old chunk of land. So it would have taken some serious event to submerge it beneath the water. And so, of course, it gets tied in with all sorts of things, from Atlantis to, I heard one brilliant story where it was a jumping off point for Jesus as he traveled the world in his 30 years in the lead up before he did his 3 years of mission from 30 to 33, learning the knowledge of the world. This is how widespread and the stories around this place are. So it's a fascinating thing. I would recommend anyone go look up those maps. It's HY and then BRASIL. And if you go and look up those maps, it's just remarkable to think that that's a thing that's happening. And most of them suggest that it's, like I say, just sort of northwest, just off kind of Mayo coast, quite a ways, and a substantial piece of land. So yeah, that's one that's always fascinated me. I read a brilliant short story about it. I'm considering using it for the podcast, where, it's represented as a kind of magical land that you have to travel under the waves to get to. And there's this brilliant description in the short story, which is itself an old story. I think it's some 250 years old, where you have to travel under the waves until eventually you come to a place that seems to represent air again, although it's effectively under a sea sky, and there's this whole alternative world going on in this place. So yeah, really one of the things that tickled me most about Irish mythology when I heard about it.
What's interesting about the whole Brassel mythical island stuff is that you mentioned the Perry Reese map. And for those of you that are not familiar, Perry Reese, he was an Ottoman navigator, geographer, and cartographer. And the most important thing there was that he was a cartographer. And during that time period was the quote unquote age of exploration was going on as well. I think it was it 1492? So he kind of like was around towards the latter end of that. Maps were very important. Cartography was very important. You had to be very accurate or else you were going to get lost. So the fact that it appears on multiple maps throughout multiple centuries, like maybe it succumbed to sea levels rising for a scientific answer, potentially, but the fact that it's on multiple maps and someone as credible as Perry Reese putting it on his map, I think it leads to some credence that there was something there at one point.
Yeah, even that Mercator one, I mean, that's a fantastic map. If you go on to Wikipedia and look up Brassel, the mythological island, you'll see that Mercator map. And it's again, 1590s, I think. I'll clarify the date again in a second. But it's so accurate at that point, to think that they had cartography to such a science, where you can recognize very clearly the shapes of Norway and Sweden and Britain and Ireland and Spain and France and Italy and all the rest of it. And they've got those things down to such a fine art. And there's Brassel right off the coast of Ireland. I mean, that to me is fascinating. And like I say, it speaks to some sort of truth behind whatever the hell is going on with this story, And like I say, that's 1595, that Mercator map. Remarkable stuff.
I actually, out of curiosity, and this is just the skeptic in me just wondering out loud, because I would, based off the story we've been telling Urban Hearing so far, I think it's fascinating. And I think it's like I'm leaning more towards, pure mystery with this island than any skepticism. But I would have to ask, like, from a cartography perspective, what is the likelihood that somebody like that brilliant, well-known cartographer created a map just, who knows, whatever motivation he had to, falsely. And what's the likelihood that map was gotten to other people and recreated without actually traveling to that island, like just copied? You know what I mean? Just like drawn on a new map separately in a different part of the world. Would people have almost certainly gone to it and seen it themselves in order to plot it? Or back then, over the centuries, was it more likely that word got around, maps got around, and they were just recreated from the original map? And I'm just trying to wonder from like an origination perspective, like who's the originator that it could be attributed to from the beginning, and how could that affect, either confusion or falsification? But I could be completely off the mark. Maybe most cartographers in different parts of the world had to have traveled to that location and mapped it out in order for it to be accurate from their part of the world. So I don't know. Do you guys have any knowledge on that or anything to say about that?
Well, I would suggest that you've pretty much put your finger on it there, Dean, to be honest. I think like anything, we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? So we add to what we've already got in terms of base knowledge. And I don't think there's any doubt that one map will have influenced another, and therefore, well, okay, that's the general position of this and that and the other. But I suppose the fact that it is on that Catalan atlas from 1375, where, again, absolutely worth clicking on, because it's the most rudimentary looking thing in the world. They've got Ireland completely wrong. Ireland just, it's stunningly bad. Britain is quite good. France and Spain and Italy all decent. But there's that big old lump of earth on the side again, and it's hard to understand what is going on. Why would it be there, if not a thing that was originally there? And then, also, is it the Piri Reis one happens to have that in the exact same spot as that Catalan one, some 200, almost 150, 200 years later. So I think you might be onto something there, to be perfectly honest. So then it comes back to, was it there in the first place? And why are there these stories about it within the country of Ireland itself, coming from various explorations done by Irish people off the west coast? So the whole thing, yeah, it's I think, whereas it's very tempting to go into the logical kind of viewpoint, which I find it very hard to argue with that observation of yours. I think you're probably spot on. But there's a lot going on there as well in terms of, are we saying that every one of these renowned map makers is just taking things for granted? How likely is that Mercator and Piri Reis are just going to take it for granted that a thing is there? I'm not sure how that works, and it would take more exploration and more finding out about what the nature of cartography was. But it was there at some point, it would appear. And then if it was, where did it go? I guess that's the thing that we circle back to, right?
I'm totally with you. Absolutely. 100%, especially since you added on that last bit that I was not aware of, which, there are cultural narratives from Irish stories, essentially, about different people who don't necessarily interact with each other, having stories about running into this small island off the coast of Ireland. And I think if there's anything that adds credibility to the story of Brassel, then it would be that. Because you could argue all day, and I just have to say, I love joking about this. I take it too lightly sometimes, probably, but the fallacy of human nature is we just kind of believe what we hear a lot of the time. And I kind of just chuckle to myself sometimes with stories like this, that for centuries, it's a mystery, and so much time and effort and thought and human effort to go into trying to discover what's going on. And it's just two drunk guys at a table one day and just talking, and then somebody overheard him and then put it on a map. And then it's just forever a waste of time for everybody, because it was just two drunk guys 1,000 years ago just messing around. That's what I just think, that's 90% of the shit that human beings do in this world, is just follow the shit that other people did as a joke.
Kind of like that
ago.
butthole demon dude from Japan.
The butthole demon, yeah. Trev, if you're not familiar, there is a demon in Japanese culture that has the body of a man, walks around on all fours, but in place of his butthole is a single eye that peeps at you and winks at you from behind. And apparently the first experience was some drunk Japanese man 200 years ago ran into this thing, and he told this story, and now today everybody has this story about this butthole demon that runs around and flashes you. Proof of concept.
Tremendous. Wow. If you guys do episode art, we've got an absolute winner there. You can just get a leprechaun with his butthole and an all-seeing eye stuck right in there. I think that covers all our bases, right?
We don't even need the podcast. We just need that picture. Put on a t-shirt. We'll be successful.
The butthole leprechaun fairy.
But so the last thing, or not necessarily the last thing, but one big thing for me that I wanted to touch on briefly that we haven't mentioned yet is that and I actually see in some of the things I'm reading that this is, some people say this is bullshit because it wasn't fitting the time period and all that. But one of the fascinating theories about Brassel Island is that it was a place where Merlin used to hide. I think it was some prince or something like that in lore. I don't know if you guys you don't even know what I'm talking about, but oh, actually, never mind. Forget that. That's a popular culture reference. My bad. Don't Don't bring that up because I thought I was reading that as like a theory, but it's actually someone just used that idea of high Brassel in their fiction writing that had Merlin in it. But it sounded interesting at first, so yeah, we'll just ignore that.
You know what it could. You know what it could be, Dean. It could be. I think with the Arthurian legend thing with Merlin, there was again a misty covered island called Avalon, and it might be a comparison, a cultural comparative. Does that make sense? That might be where that's coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's still an interesting concept that, like, someone could be intentionally masking the island. And that's actually one thing that I wanted to touch on as well, which is in our age, 2024, modern technology, lots of geospatial satellites going around the world taking pictures in high resolution, lots of measurement and signals collection, all that stuff going on around the globe 24/7. I would imagine that at some point, if something like this did exist, or even just in the same vein somewhere around the globe, somebody with a private satellite, not necessarily like we could get into like government conspiracies and all that, but like we're getting into an age where space-based exploration is becoming a private venture. And that's not just sending spaceships and humans into space. That's just essentially sending assets into space, like satellites that do data collection and communication and all that stuff. They're privately owned. They're not controlled or monitored or owned by any government. So when you start getting to that level of technology and awareness in a civilization, in a race, like a human race or whatever, like that to me screams that if we're ever going to find out anything about something like this, it's going to be in this time period. Because you can, like I said, you talk about conspiracies about government bodies or groups of individuals who control certain swaths of the world, like keeping things under wraps. But we're getting to a point where there are so many companies who can do all of this with their own budgeting, no oversight, all that stuff. It just seems extremely unlikely that this stuff could stay hidden forever. I think the next 20 years or so with technology are just going to be absolutely fascinating in terms of discovering these anomalies and these strange occurrences,
the fairies are gonna let
like
them.
Brassel Island.
You think the fairies?
Maybe they'll just stay cloaked. Maybe they'll just stay cloaked forever. They'll just stay cloaked forever. They just say, fuck it. There's too many satellites.
I hope this doesn't blindside you. But what the fuck is a Dullahan?
Oh, okay. So the way I was taught this, and again, this is just my own little take on it. I have not researched this, but a Dullahan is how we would pronounce it around here with our version of Gaelic. It gets confusing. There are at least three different dominant types of the language and different pronunciations and stuff. Yeah, so Dullahan is a headless horseman, if that isn't too shocking, and of course you guys will be aware of the story there that most people are familiar with. Dullahan often can be linked to being on horseback, but basically they're a headless creature. I mean, it's freaky stuff. They're deeply disturbing creatures. The way I was told about it, or the thing that I learned about it, was, again, as they always are, they're a bad omen, a bad sign. You do not want to see these things, which, I mean, it should stand to reason that you don't want to see a headless creature at any point in your life. But yeah, the Dullahan specifically was this sort of, you'll have heard of the puka as well. And puka was a shapeshifter, but puka is just, again, a general term. That's the Irish word for ghost, puka. So again, it's sort of got, I think, a little bit changed over time and whatever. But the original idea of the Dullahan is that guy is this headless entity, a bit like the Far Goethe, who would wander, this emaciated skeletal creature, not a thing you wanted to encounter. And you mentioned one earlier on, Chris. I might as well just bring them in there as well, which is the Irish version of mermaids. Didn't you mention that earlier on? I think you did.
That I did. And I think I also mentioned a Kelpie.
A Kelpie? Oh, you might have caught me there. Let me just see if I can access that in the back of my mind. But the Irish mermaid was the Merrow. and it was could also be male on occasion. And these again, there's a brilliant kind of crossover here almost with the changeling. They would come ashore and inveigle themselves into people's lives and stuff like that. Not like the kind of siren creatures that you associate with other stories and other mythologies where, you know, the mermaids are like sirens and they lure you onto the rocks and all of that with their beauty. These were, again, like all of these bloody creatures, trickster beings in a way. Again, in the telling that I'm familiar with. And please, you know, send all your emails to Chris and Dean about how I'm not an expert. Don't send them to me. I have the lads give my details at the end. I'm not claiming to be, but I'm just telling you what my experience of it is, that they could, you know, they had the ability to inveigle themselves into the lives of people and might, you know, take part in society for a while and that type of thing. What was the other one you said? Kelpie.
Yeah.
I don't know what a Kelpie is. What did you hear about that?
I apologize. That one is more Scottish. So essentially what a Kelpie is, it's this horse. It's a water horse. It's like appears to people by like a river or something. And it's this really nice horse. And it kind of lures you in to get on, like to mount it. And then apparently what it'll do is it'll start running across the water and then just dive while you're on it and you can't get off. And it just fucking just drowns you.
Come on, Scotland.
So fucked up.
Oh, come on, Scotland. Damn Scots.
Yeah,
they ruined Scotland. As Willie would say.
Of the creature apparently becomes adhesive. I don't know who the fuck survived to tell this story, but yeah, you just get drug into the water and it drowns you. What a shitty horse. I thought horses were nice. But...
Yeah, I love the way the things that they all have in common is they just want to do bad shit to you. That's, you know, this is the thing that they all have in common. I mean, one of the best creatures that I remember from Irish, you know, mythology is a thing called an ulfeist. Now, ul is sort of large or all-encompassing, and a peist is like a worm. But this was obviously so this huge, all-encompassing worm, and it was again it was in the sea usually, and it was this kind of horrible sea snake creature that could come on the land as well, lizard-like as well in certain other tellings of the story, and it just I think an awful lot of the reason why these stories happen around the sea and the creatures happen to be sea creatures in a lot of cases, and you can tell me if you think this is nonsense, is because I have family that live right on the coast in the west, and they would tell you that none of them learned how to swim, and that's like from my father's generation, that age. None of them learned how to swim because they had this general fear of the water and they didn't ever want to be in the sea. And if they were in the sea, this is a weird sort of screwed up logic, but if you knew how to swim, it would only prolong the misery, if you understand what I'm saying. That's how deep set the fear of the sea was. So to me, it makes perfect sense that you've got all these horrific sea snakes and merrows and all those kind of things that exist around the sea because of that inbuilt innate fear. And you're talking about people here who made their living in boats on the sea, going out in these little flimsy currachs to try and fill them with fish to bring back to their family. And a lot of the guys in those boats could not swim and would not learn how to swim because the sea was a place of fear and darkness and the unknown, and it makes sense, I guess, in the vein of what Dean was saying earlier on, that we would make up stories, therefore, to explain that to ourselves.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how that traverses across cultures, because in one of the episodes that we talked about, Dean, the one that we covered, where we talked about was it night hags? It kind of encompassed like the night hags, and then you gave the story about this queen of the sea in Indonesia that that calls to people in their sleep.
Yes. I was just thinking about that. I think Trev, you hit the nail on the head. I think that it's, and you can even broaden out the discussion even wider. I think because okay, let's entertain the idea really quickly that these creatures, at least some of these creatures are real. But there's something I wanted to bring up that I didn't get a chance to bring up earlier, but it's like this whole vein of, it kind of ties back in with the whole concept we were talking about with the wave function and how it's kind of a little bit narcissistic to say that just because we need to be around, our consciousness needs to be around to see something, that's how it comes to fruition and travels from being a particle to a wave, or sorry, a wave to a particle. Or essentially from light to matter, but it's like the same kind of concept with these creatures. So like we talk about these creatures as if we know them inside and out. We have stories about leprechauns, and we have every aspect about the leprechauns, every aspect in any culture, like the La Lorna, or like
La
what's
Llorona.
that again, Chris? La Lorna, is that the right way to say it? La Llorona. So like so every culture. And even my Indonesian example, where the Queen of the Sea, she lures men in her dreams, beautiful temptress, and she just promises you riches and love and the greatest sex you've ever had, and then you end up going to drown yourself to get it because that's what you have to do. But essentially, what you end up doing is just feeding her. So that's a story in Indonesian culture. So I think this idea, though, that humans can give, like humans claim to know inside and out what these things are and their total makeup, but I think that's extremely unlikely. I think maybe we capture 10, 20, maybe 30% of what the actual truth of these things are, but the rest is completely fabricated. The rest is just bullshit. So I like think about stories where, like, Chris, your horse example, your Scottish horse water example, and then we were talking about how these things seem to always want to do bad things to people. But I wonder if that's even the case. Like, if these things really are mythological creatures that exist, and maybe they occasionally harm people, I don't like to think that they are just purely out there to harm people. Like, I think that they would probably operate with multiple different levels, just like humans do. Like, there are some humans who like to hurt people. There are some humans who like to take care of people, and everything in between. But just for humans to say that we understand what these things are, what they look like, every attribute possible about them, I think that's kind of vain, and it's probably almost certainly incorrect. But I'm not saying the creatures aren't real. I'm just saying that we probably find different ways to interpret them other than what they really are. So I have to wonder what the really
that's
are
a good
part
point,
is.
man. You know what's going to happen? We're going to release this episode. Then Trev's going to send us a message that a group of fairies were banging on his window, coming to break his legs because of all the shit we're talking about.
Dean, something you say there, I can't let it go. I need to ask because I'm not sure, because I haven't heard the your episodes to do with aliens, but your kindness in your interpretation of these mythical creatures, and I've got to ask, Chris. I've got to ask: do you believe in space brothers, Dean, or are you more, Independence Day, let's shoot the shit out of all these bastards? Where are you on the whole benevolent alien thing?
How much time you got, Trev? No, I'm just kidding, man. I promise I won't make this long. So honestly, my perspective is, so when I was younger, I believed in aliens for sure. I loved the idea of our different creatures or races coming to visit us from different parts of the universe. However, the older I get and the more scientific understanding that I become aware of, especially in terms of anatomy, I always go back to this concept. And I know Chris and I disagree on this, which is totally fine. But my perspective is that all of our images of extraterrestrials, they appear to be humanoid, human-like. They have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 sets of eyes, 2 ears, a mouth, all that stuff. Yeah. So for a creature to evolve so close to our anatomy, billions and billions or millions of light years away, and be around for millions of years, that just does not make scientific sense. They theoretically should look and act and feel and think completely differently than how we interpret them to be. So that leads me to believe that either there's some kind of misinterpretation, or maybe even some shadiness going on where maybe there are aliens out there that are trying to interact with us in a certain way, and they fabricated these extraterrestrials that we see to look more like us, so we feel more comfortable around them. But that's kind of shoddy too. Like, that doesn't make too much sense. Why would you not just make them look exactly like us? And so in a nutshell, just going back to your question, I do believe that I tend to be more in the camp that there are intelligent extraterrestrials out there, and there are some weird occurrences happening with unidentified aerial phenomena around our planet. I just don't know what they are. And I always go back to that idea that they always look humanoid. So maybe they're robots, maybe they're biological, but maybe we came from them. Maybe they fabricated us. There's something more to that, but that's my answer. And hopefully that kind of like sets you up for your what you were getting at.
Oh, absolutely. That's very cool. I agree with you. I really like your take on it there, and I'd be very sympathetic in a lot of it. And actually, it doesn't need to lead to any difference at all, because I think we were all kind of driving the bus towards this idea of things not necessarily being in the way that we've been fed them, and perhaps aliens, in inverted commas, are no different to Dullahans and Fergurtas and all these kind of creatures, in terms of being some sort of manifestations via some liminal space of some other either alternative reality, dimension, etc. And I think that's where it gets really interesting for me. And I don't know if you want me to tie a knot in this, but I can't let this one go because I completely forgot. I can't believe you guys invited me on to talk about mythology, and I haven't really talked about any myth at all. For the record, there are all these incredible stories that I should have told you, and I feel like an idiot that I didn't tell you. But, they're kind of folklore, and people will either know them or not, and I think an awful lot of them will. Stories like the stories of Cuchulainn, and the stories of Fionn McCool, the stories of the Tawnbo Cúilnge and stuff like that. They're incredibly well-known Irish myths, and I've completely failed to mention any of them. So to make up for that, I do want to mention one, which is Tír na nÓg. And the reason I want to mention Tír na nÓg is because it ties beautifully into something we've already discussed. I mean, again, the other ones I could have mentioned, the Children of Lir, you've heard of that one. The story of Diarmid and Gráinne, you might have heard of this one. But Tír na nÓg is literally translates as the land of the young and the land of youth. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because it was this mystical place that you would travel to by a magical horse across the sea. And when you got there, the people there would never age, and you would have endless food and all the best things in the world that you could have. Guess who was associated with that at one stage? The Tuatha Dé Danann. And the story of Tír na nÓg, in a nutshell, that I would have learned was that Oisín, who was the son of Fionn McCool, the greatest Irish warrior of all time, and the leader of the Fianna, Oisín was put under a spell by this incredibly beautiful woman who appeared on this white horse. Her name was Niamh Ciannóir, which means Niamh of the golden hair. And she puts him, what we say in Irish, faoi gheasa, which means under a spell, and he has to do what he's told. And she tells him that she is now going to take him with her, and she's now going to take him as a husband. And he is delighted because she's so beautiful, but also sad because he will be leaving his father, Fionn, and all the Fianna, the great soldiers of Ireland. They were often pictured as, if not giants, almost giants. Anyway, they go across the water on these magical white horses to the land of Tír na nÓg. They raise their own family. I don't know how that works, because if people can't get older, how did the babies grow? I don't know. Take it up with the author of the story. But anyway, they do raise their own family. And eventually Oisín feels a little bit homesick, and he says, I want to go back to Ireland and see how Dad's getting on and the Fianna. I miss the lads. So he gets the magical horse, and Niamh says, whatever you do, don't get off the horse. Don't get off the horse. So he gets the magical horse. He goes back to Ireland across the waves. And when he arrives, it doesn't look like it used to look. And he's very puzzled by this. And then he realizes that 300 years have passed, and everyone he knows is dead. And he gets overcome by this wave of sadness. and he's riding the horse through a field, and he sees these local little Irish farmer peasants trying to pick big rocks up out of a field to clear it for pasture. And in an act of generosity, he leans his big, muscular, superhuman body down. The strap breaks in the saddle. He falls to the ground, and he immediately becomes the age that he should be. Guess who he meets then in this state of agedness? St. Patrick. And St. Patrick and Oisin have this series of dialogues where Christianity and paganism get put in opposition, and they talk it out, and it's the subject of so much poetry and song in Irish tradition. It's absolutely fantastic. And doesn't Tiernan Og sound like Hi Brazil to you? I just love the way everything came together there at the end.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I've never heard that story before, so I definitely have to look that up.
There's a few things I want to say that this is just like, this is why we do this. Like, I just want to say real quick that everyone we talk to is so brilliant. They have so many stories and so much to add, so much rich narrative and experiences. And like every single person in our 50 episodes, well, I mean, we haven't always have not had people on, but every time we have someone on, it's just so amazing. Cause just like you, Chris, I have never heard any of these stories. Now I know, actually, when you told some of these stories, Trev, now I know where some of these writers for like science fiction TV shows got their ideas from, because these sound exactly like some episodes that I watched from, like, say, Stargate or something like that, which is funny because like that just tells you like all you need to do to get rich and famous with stories and entertainment is just to copy some Irish Gaelic tale from like 150, 200 years ago, and you'll make a lot of money. But the thing you said about the never getting off the horse, to me, that sounds like, not turning around and looking at Gomorrah or whatever the destruction, turning into a pillar of salt or whatever. And I wonder if there's some bleed over there, because when you did tie it back into St. Patrick and the narrative between Christianity and paganism, I thought that was such an interesting, beautiful concept. And just, I mean, I don't know how it came out, that conversation. I mean, I know it's probably almost certainly completely fabricated, but just the idea of someone coming up with that narrative, or that dialogue between Christianity and paganism to try to work it out, quote unquote, work it out, meaning we're not going to hack and slash each other. We're going to try to make sense of this world together, because you have your stories, we have our stories, and there's some mythological sides to it. There's some scientific sides to it. And at the end of the day, though, we're just humans trying to operate in this three-dimensional space and make sense of all this crazy shit going on around us. And it's just so awesome that we could tell stories like this and look back and talk about them. So
Trev, before we got back on to continue today's show, which we're really grateful for your time. Like, this is really awesome. You didn't have to stay on this long, but we really appreciate your time. And I know it's almost 10:30 p.m. your time over there. Again, thank you. What I did want to ask is, you mentioned offline that your parents had a friend that was an exorcist. I know we're talking about Irish myth and folklore and whatnot. Did you have any interesting tales to share on that front that you would be comfortable sharing?
So this was a guy who worked in Ethiopia, and he was, like I said, my parents went around collecting priest and nun friends like they were some sort of Pokemon. It was remarkable to watch them go, and they would come back to our house, and we'd meet all these individuals. And because my mum worked in a place called St. Columban's, which is the home of a missionary order, she would regularly encounter, therefore, these people who were out on the missions, so to speak. And one of these was this guy who worked. This guy was actually a Carmelite, unless I'm mistaken. So he just happened to know some of these Columbans and got to know my mother through there. She worked in the infirmary. This dude would tell you stories that would literally, to be fair, he wasn't really allowed to tell us the stories until the last time I saw him. And he told me stories about possession that changes your perspective. And I remember asking him, Chris, what do you think this is? when you're talking to me about this young girl who is screaming these obscenities in her own language and is clearly being physically manipulated and twisted into shapes that she's not capable of doing or should not be capable of doing, and is apparently, lifting off the ground, and is, he said at one point, I know you guys touched on this before in previous ones, that there was at least 2 Latin phrases that came out of this one particular girl. What do you think that is? Connell was his name. What do you think that is? And he said, I don't know. And I'll never forget that, because for me, I was expecting the hard sell, right? I was expecting, well, it's the devil, you idiot. It's a manifestation of the opposite of what I stand for. And that's what it is. And, that's what The Exorcist told us, right? That's what all these other movies tell us. That's, I know you guys have touched on Pazuzu at one point, right? So you're familiar with all these concepts of how these are embodiments of various forms of evil. And I thought he would just pass me off with that, but he didn't. He said, I don't know. And what was most interesting about that dude was he was fucking shattered, man. He was exhausted. He was taking on these things. And that's why I can't dismiss anyone of faith, because he was doing that because he believed in his version of faith. But I don't think that's where he ended up. I think he ended up in a position where he understood that he could do something to intervene, to take the suffering away from these people. And he did. And every single time he was more and more shattered by it physically. He looked like an 80-year-old man, and he was 45. It was remarkable. He was the picture of why. You remember we talked earlier on about turn away from this shit, don't get involved with this shit. He was the reason why you don't get involved. But he was a remarkable man because he was doing it to help.
And
does that make sense?
Interesting that you brought up, how he looked just shattered. And it reminds me of Father Malachi Martin, who was from Ireland as well. He talks about that. He talks about, like, when you do that stuff, like literally every exorcism you do, it takes a piece away from you. Like a piece of you literally dies anytime you do that. So it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that, like, from another person that's not well known, but doing like the hard work in the trenches for those people, trying to help those people. Dean, I wanted to throw it to you before I ask my final question before we wrap up for today. Was there anything else that you had for Trev?
I don't have any other questions, but I do want to talk about this momentarily, about the concept of exorcisms. And the first thing I'll say up front is, I mean, like, God, I mean, seriously, man, like I mean, it's going to sound so corny, but I promise I'm trying to be as genuine as possible. I've always believed in this. Like, it's the Batman complex, like, you as a human being, what more beautiful, awesome thing could you possibly do with your life than quietly sacrifice it for somebody else to make their lives not necessarily more comfortable, but better, and even extending their lives in some ways. And I mean, it's an awesome concept, and it's very beautiful, and I think it's very powerful. Whatever is going on, there's some degree of power going on there that can fight whatever degradation or evil that goes on in this world. But to hear those stories and think about it from a not necessarily purely religious perspective, but also like a spiritual perspective, like going back hundreds of years, like even touching on paganism, and I would just be fascinated to get into this idea of exorcisms from different points in time in different religions, because we can always group the idea of exorcisms into, like, okay, actually strange phenomena where, like you guys were saying, contortions are happening, strange things are happening, lights are flickering, things are just not supposed to happen the way they're happening. But then there's the other camp, which is, oh, maybe this person is having a psychological episode. And Chris, you've mentioned this in previous podcasts, where the Catholic Church, the first thing they'll do is ask, has this person had a psychological evaluation? But there's always like this, and this is the whole reason why our podcasts exist. We talk about, 90% skeptic, but then 10-20% is unexplainable. And you can do the same thing with the exorcism aspect. And I think that this would be worth exploring in depth later. but like just the idea that someone can come along and really have no idea. Like you said, Trev, he's like, I have no idea what's going on. You're expecting a whole breakdown and going in like, oh, this is certainly the devil. This is certainly evil work. This is blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, like he was just a dude who was just trying to help people out. And he really was exhausted, just had no idea what was going on. And I think that when you talk about somebody who is that perceptive and special to that degree, where they're being completely open and honest and they don't have anything to gain from it, that's when you really start getting close to the reality of what these things are and what these occurrences are. And I would love this conversation and how it touched on that. I think we need to delve more into stuff like that if possible.
I'd love to go there if that's okay with you guys at some point, because it's endlessly fascinating. And to talk to a guy like that when you're such a young person, early teens or whatever I was, that never leaves you. It's like any of the other experiences I've mentioned. They severely impact you. And what I took away, Dean, was exactly what you took away, which is like, this is just a good man trying to do things. And, as far as skepticism goes, it doesn't come into the picture here at all, because whatever that was, it was fucking real. It was real for that woman. It was real for the guy who was performing the exorcism, because you could see that reality all over his face. And yeah, for that reason, it's an endlessly fascinating topic. So if you ever are diving in there in the future,
definitely. We'll definitely get you on for more episodes.
I'd love to get involved.
This has been great, but I like to ask all of our guests this question, and I think you know where I'm going with this one, Dean. I tend to do it a lot. Final question for the night, Trev, before we let you go. What are your personal thoughts on folks that, like you mentioned earlier, like are religious, believe in God, go to church, they take the Eucharist, they go to Mass, whatever. They do all that stuff. But at the same time, you try to talk to them about whether it be fairies or the Banshee or the Wendigo or demons or anything of that sort, and they just outright reject it. Why do you think that is?
So the simple thing is, I think everyone gets a worldview that they're comfortable with. And I think those of us who are brave enough to embrace a worldview that's distinctly uncomfortable, where there are no specific answers, where you realize, and you have the humility to fucking realize that you don't know everything. And in fact, you know a lot less than you thought you knew. They're the people I want to talk to. And whether you are someone who's fanatical about your religion and therefore exclude all other possibilities outside of that, or whether you are one of the new religion, a scientism advocate, and therefore exclude anything outside of that, you are, for me, equally guilty of being closed off to a huge amount of possibility, and I would suggest probability, that there are things out there that you don't understand. And I don't have advice for anybody. Fuck's sake, I've made so many mistakes in my life. I'm not going to preach to anyone. The only thing that I know is that I am sure that the way that I'm looking at the world at the moment is the right way to look at it, which is to have a little bit of humility in your heart, to be as curious, intellectually curious as possible, to go down all these rabbit holes until you get that spidey sense feeling I was telling you about before, where you just go, nope, I've had enough of that, and just keep seeing what's out there and be open to it as a possibility. When you get dogmatic, when you know you're right, when you've stopped learning, I'm done with you as a person, because I don't know what you are. You think you're some sort of what did you complete life? Did you win the game? Do you now have all the answers? That kind of arrogance I can't get on board with. And so I'd be in that, to use the phrase, liminal space, where I can admit the fact that I don't know everything and still be curious enough to say, well, I want to know the answer. So let's ask those questions. Let's see what comes up. Let's try to hold two different ideas in our head at the same time and not be arrogant enough to suggest that one of them is absolutely the correct answer. So I can embrace skepticism, but I can also embrace people who are wildly full of faith once they're willing to have that openness, if that makes sense, Chris. I don't know if I've gone around the houses there, but it's a pretty strong belief of mine that you've got to maintain that intellectual curiosity and not try to be dogmatic in your worldview, because that way,
that's
that
well
way
put,
disappointment lies.
I completely agree. Any final thoughts, Dean?
Trev, I expect you next time when you come back on to bring your younger brother Colin Farrell on, and we'll have a nice conversation with somebody who will bring. No, I'm just kidding, man. I really appreciate your time, man, and you've lived up to the mark of someone who's very well spoken and very knowledgeable. Even though you're honestly very open minded, and you don't, like you said, you don't talk yourself up at all, not self centered whatsoever. So.
Yeah, so the only thing I would say, and I think we'll cross over nicely with you and your audience, and before I say anything, talk about convivial hosts. I've really enjoyed the chat. It's been fantastic. You guys talk about stuff that's right in my wheelhouse, so I appreciate your time just as much, and I hope and people will be interested in what we came up with. And if you are, and if you think you could listen to me telling you stories, that's what I do on my show, The Great Stories, where I pick the very finest short stories from all the very finest writers. And I read the story and then speak about it for a little while afterwards. It's gone over quite well. I am hopeful of growing it. I think there'll be a nice crossover with your audience, because I only pick stories that are either have some kind of a hook where there's a mystery, or there's some kind of, geopolitical fuckery going on in the background, some kind of historical aspect, some kind of supernatural aspect. They're the things that really float my boat, and they're why I pick the stories I pick. And anyone who knows my show will be familiar with the little rants that you've heard tonight, because I go on about them all the time on my own show. So if you want to go and have a look at greatstoriespod.com, that's my website. There's a place you can support the show, a little button you can click. You can become an executive producer, which is what I call anyone who contributes to the show on a regular basis, because that's exactly what they are. And there are, I think, almost 60, 57, 58 stories there already for you to dive into on the website. And of course, it's available on whatever podcast app that you use. But again, guys, thanks a million for your time too. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's not often you get to speak to guys who are open-minded and can bring the conversation intellectually in places that you mightn't expect. So been a treat.
Really quick, Trev, can you spell out the URL there for the people?
Yes, absolutely. So it's greatstoriespod.com.
Thank you, folks. Thank you for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a rating on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please share the show with your friends, as that would help us grow immensely. Also, be sure to follow us on social media. You can find us on TikTok at twrpodcast, our Instagram at twroadpodcast, and our Facebook by searching for The Wandering Road Podcast. If you'd like to get a hold of us, you can reach us at our email address, twroadpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. We would love to have you on the show as a guest so you can share your stories, or you could submit email submissions of your stories that we could dedicate an episode to. Thanks, and we'll catch you on the next one.